want to welcome from the stage of Quay, Mike Williams. Mike, welcome to the show. I'm excited. You can tell.
Rick, thank you so much for the intro. I hope I live up to it.
You're going to do great. I mean, I'm really have been talking about this for a while. As I was just saying, I rant once in a while about the Beatles because I kind of take some flack for it, and I don't get it. I never got it. I tried. It's not an effort of trying, but I just never felt a connection to their music. And it's changing, as I said, slowly. It's getting there. I'm starting to appreciate it, I think, because of the musicianship. But it's still not like what most fanatics are like. And so, but I like music from that genre. I'm very into, all those other bands. I like the Doors, and I like the Stones, and I like a lot of those older bands. I like Elvis. I mean, I'm all through. I just, the Beatles never stuck with me. So I'm here to learn from you, Mike. I want to know about the Beatles, how they started, what is going on with them. There's a lot of rumors. Is Paul dead? I want to find out what you think. And just wherever you want it to start, right at the beginning. How about the beginning?
Well, the beginning would be I was one of those people that loved the Beatles, Rick. I grew up with them. Back in 1968, I was a little Beatle freak. I was born in 59, so I was 9 years old in 1968. And I was well aware of the Beatles. And I begged my parents to take me to the movie theater to go see Yellow Submarine. And so my father took both myself and my brother. My brother's 15 months younger than I am. So we had these two little Beatle fans going to the movie theater to go see the movie. And I remember being disappointed because I didn't realize it was an animation. Mm-hmm. But at the very end, the Beatles come out. It's like a 10-minute little segment at the end of the film. And that made it for me. Now, my father had to sit there for an hour and a half in anguish because Dad did not get the Beatles. So they were very influential in my life, and music has been a big, big part of my life, and the Beatles were integral to that. Mm-hmm. And so I was a Beatle freak. I was in the church. I've said on a number of interviews that I had a front row pew in the Church of the Fab Four. And my brother used to come to my house and say that I had a Beatles shrine. I had all of this Beatle memorabilia, posters. To this day, I still have a vinyl collection of Beatle records that probably rivals just about anybody's collection of Beatle albums. I collected for years and years and years, and I collected their vinyl from all across the world. Recently, I've been selling, well, actually, I should say I sold a big chunk of it off. Mm-hmm. I kept the what I deem to be the most collectible, most valuable pieces. But what I've been doing over time, ever since I got into the research on the Beatles, and realizing that there's a completely different narrative than what we've been told.
Absolutely.
Very, very different. And so some of the luster has come off the band. I still love the music. I still like to listen to it. But it doesn't have the same impact that it used to have because of what my research has unfolded.
Mm-hmm. You've done 8 years of research, if I'm correctly remembering. 8 years is a long time. Music, when I started learning about all of what we're going to be talking about, I will agree, Mike, that music for a while, that's a great term, lackluster, because you start to really question all of music, which I'm going to get into with definitely tonight. But I get it. It's when you find out what's behind it, you're like, it really makes you look at it different.
It does. It makes you take a hard look at the industry, mm-hmm. not just the music industry, but entertainment overall.
Right.
And then when you realize that the music and entertainment industry is a huge lever in how the controllers control the world, the pieces start to come together. Now, I will say it's very difficult to get your head wrapped around this. It's a very hard pill to swallow. I was no exception. What happened to me was in 2016, I read a book titled, I'll show it here so people can see it. It's the Memoirs of Billy Shears. Okay, so the book first came out in 2009. I caught up with it in 2016. And the way I found the book, I was on Amazon, and then a recommendation popped up and said, hey, you might like this book. And so I took a look. I read the overview, and I said, okay, I'll give it a shot. And so when the book came and I started reading it, I just couldn't believe what I was reading because the the story that this book tells is so diametrically opposed to the official narrative that it makes you step back. And so I read the entire book, and I wound up having a discussion with Sophia Smallstorm going back into the earlier part of 2016. And I told her I was reading the book, and it's a very, very interesting read, and I needed time to really let things settle in because, like I said, the narrative is so different.
Right.
And she asked me to come on her show to talk about the book. And at first, I really didn't want to do it. The main reason was because the book is 666 pages, so there's the beginning of some occult numbers, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
66 chapters, some more occult numbers. And so my first thought was, well, do I really want to spend the time to boil down a 666-page book for a 90-minute or a 2-hour presentation? So Sophia, being Sophia, she was very determined to get me to talk about it. So finally I relented. In order to do the presentation, to do the show with her, I actually had to create this huge PowerPoint presentation in order to organize the book, to organize the topics so it would flow in a way that it made sense to the audience back when I did the show with her back in September of 2016. Before that, I was aware of the Paul is Dead conspiracy.
Mm-hmm.
And for those that don't know, it's a conspiracy that goes back to 1966, actually, but it got legs in 1969. And the conspiracy says that Paul McCartney, the original Paul McCartney, who I refer to as biological Paul, died in a car crash in late 1966. And we will get different dates. Some researchers will say it was August of 66. The book tells us it was September 11th of 1966. And when we get to that part of our conversation, I'll explain why I think September 11th makes more sense to me. And other researchers will say that the date was November 9th, which is the inverse of September 11th. So November 9th is September 11th.
Interesting.
And so the book talks about the Paul is Dead conspiracy. It is written in first person, and the author, who is actually really the encoder, is Thomas E.U. Harriot.
Okay.
And the reason why Tom is referred to as the encoder is because the book is encoded. It is classified as historical fiction, but because the book is layered and encoded, if you're intrepid enough, it's like a big puzzle. Let me just put it that way. So if you're interested in digging and figuring out whether the book is truthful or not, which was what I did, you start to break the code. You start to decode it. And once you do that, you come to the realization that the book is truthful. Are there threads of fiction in the book? Yes. Why is that done? For plausible deniability.
Exactly. Yep.
So it's very clear once you start reading the book, because it is just loaded up with information that, at least what I thought was, the only way that information can make it into the book is it has to come from a source that is very close or was very close to the situation or is the person that's playing the role of Paul McCartney.
Okay.
And so we get introduced to Billy Shears on the Sgt. Pepper album. We have the title track, Sgt. Pepper. Then that makes it segues into With a Little Help from My Friends. And the transition from the first track to the second track, Billy Shears is introduced, the one and only Billy Shears. And a lot of Beatle fans think that because Ringo sang the song, that Ringo is Billy Shears, and it's not. What the Beatles did was they used Ringo to sing the song as really a way to deflect away from the new Paul McCartney.
Okay.
It's very similar to what John Lennon did when Ringo released his 1973 album, his self-titled album, Ringo. And there's a song on that album titled I'm the Greatest.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm the Greatest follows the same format as With a Little Help from My Friends, where John actually wrote the song, wrote the lyrics, and the song is talking about Billy Shears.
Okay.
And Ringo sings it. But they're not talking about Ringo. They're referring back to the person that replaced Paul McCartney back in September of 1966. So, hope I didn't get too long-winded on you there.
No, that's amazing. I mean, I really want to learn about this because I have heard the Paul is Dead thing. I've heard people go back and forth, not diving too deep into it, but I do like looking. If it comes up, I'll look into it, like a few documentaries and that. I find it interesting. on both sides, and I'm very open to all of this. I mean, I don't know a lot about the Beatles. I don't make any columns about it. I just don't. It's not somebody I focused on a lot. I'm like I said, it's changing. My taste, it's growing on me, and that happened with the Doors. I remember first hearing the Doors. I did not like them. I could not stand them. I was like, get the music off. I don't understand this music. And then like 4 years later, I played the Doors, and then I loved them. And then I dove in, got all their vinyl. And so I think you have to be ready for it. So that's just the way my music taste goes. And it's changing even to this day. But I'm like, when a lot of people, I think, they see the Beatles come over and they break, I think, on the Ed Sullivan Show. What show is it that people remember?
Yeah, it was the Ed Sullivan Show back in '64.
Right, but I like the way you go back to the beginning. That's where I want to start. People have this image of the Beatles, like we're saying on the Ed Sullivan Show, but I found their history before that really fascinating, and I wonder if a lot of people don't even know about it.
I should also mention that my research goes way beyond Paul McCartney being swapped out and replaced.
It sure does, yeah.
So for me, the replacement of Paul McCartney became a subplot, that there's a much larger play at hand. And it has to do with the Beatles as a massive psychological operation to social engineer the world, and being a creation of the Tavistock Institute out of Britain. And the Tavistock Institute reports up through the Committee of 300. And there's a couple of books, if you don't mind me, Rick, taking a moment here to get people acclimated. So the world, the way it's presented to the masses as to how it works with presidents and prime ministers and parliaments and the Congress, if we're talking about the United States, that's all theatrics. That's all puppet theater in front of the curtain. If you really want to know how the world works, I would say start with this book here. This is by Dr. John Coleman. The book was released in the early 1990s. It's the Committee of 300.
Okay.
And in this book, Coleman talks a bit about the Beatles being a creation of Tavistock, because Tavistock reports into the Committee of 300. The Committee of 300 refer to themselves as the Olympians, the gods.
Oh, wow.
Okay? So that's book number one. So once you get through that book and you understand about the Committee of 300, then I recommend these two books to learn about Tavistock. Tavistock is very, very important. And it's very important to understand who they are and how they go about their business. They are fundamental to all of the deception, the social engineering, the mass manipulation, the brainwashing and the mind control that takes place across the world. And this is another topic where a lot of people have a difficult time trying to understand how it is an organization like Tavistock has that much power. And we could talk about it as we progress through the show, and I'll explain it the best I can. But the best way to understand it is not listening to me on this show, because I can only cover it from a high-level perspective because of time. Here's a book by Daniel Estulen. It's called Tavistock, Social Engineering the Masses. So I recommend this book. This is a very good primer. Then what we want to do is, let me see if I have it here. Hopefully I do. Okay, well, there's another book by Dr. John Coleman, and it's his book on Tavistock. I don't have it here in front of me, but that book is absolutely fabulous. So read Daniel's book first, and then jump to Dr. John Coleman's book on Tavistock.
Okay.
And you'll have a very quick grasp on why it is that they are very, very important to what goes on in the world and how the world operates. Behind all this is an ideology, a spiritual ideology that goes back to this guy, Aleister Crowley.
Who we're going to dive into. Crazy. Yep.
So a very good book to understand Crowley as far as his connections into British intelligence going back to World War I. It's a book by Richard Spence titled Secret Agent 666.
I have to get that book.
It's a very good book. Another book on Crowley that I'm about a third of the way through right now, and it's also a very good book, is this one here. It's Aleister Crowley and the Cult of Pan.
Okay, I got to write that down. Okay.
That's another very good book. So that's just some of my recommendations before we get started, because people will ask about Crowley, they will ask about Tavistock, they will ask about the Committee of 300, and like I said, I can only cover so much in an interview.
I agree.
And to really understand, folks, you're going to have to roll up your sleeves and dig in. You're going to have to read books. You're going to have to do research and connect the dots.
Yeah. And that's what happened to me, Mike, is that I've heard it over the years. I've heard of Tavistock, and, I think a lot of listeners have they got kind of an idea of what they are, but it was somebody that emailed me and said, you got to really dig into Tavistock. You can't just watch a 1 hour documentary and think you got the picture, which was the mistake I did at first. And then when I started reading more and diving into it, it really, to me, it's a picture. It's part of the puzzle. I was saying to you when we did our little pre-interview on Saturday, I said, I think that's a major piece of the picture people are missing is the Tavistock and just how powerful they are. I keep trying to tell people on the show what we're up against,
right?
And that they're into everything. I said, and then some people say, oh, so everything in life is a lie. I'm like, well, it's definitely being manipulated. It's being twisted, and they're into everything. Pick the thing, schooling, medicine, government, anything. They're in there, and they're steering people. And so people have to, like you said, read and really dive into Tavistock and the Committee of 300. It's key to figuring out what's going on in our world today.
Yeah, and once you do that, when you used to ask the question, you mean everything is a lie? You'll start to understand that, yes, just about everything is a lie.
Agreed.
I know it's not something people want to hear, but if you don't want to hear it and you want to deny it, then what's going to happen is it's going to be status quo. Things are going to continue to go the way they're going, and they're not going in a good direction. But if you educate yourself on how the control system works, how the deep state works, how it really works, not this nonsense that they talk about on Fox News and MSNBC and stuff like that, then we increase the odds that we're going to be able to turn the ship around. Because if you don't understand your enemy, if you don't understand their tactics, if you don't understand how they operate, then how are you going to defeat them?
I agree with everything you're saying. That's why I'm nodding here.
Yeah, so the Beatles are a creation of Tavistock. This came out as a clue, actually, in the memoirs of Billy Shears that I picked up going back a number of years ago with regard to their music. The Beatles not writing all of their own music and not being on all of their recorded tracks. So now what happens, Rick, is with a lot of researchers that do the whole Paul is dead bit, they primarily focus on the replacement of Paul McCartney. So they will major on, well, here's biological Paul McCartney, and here's the guy that replaced him. And some will refer to him as Fall. I call him Billy because he refers to himself as Billy Shears. In the book, he gives us an alias. He says his name is William Shepherd. What does a shepherd do? A shepherd leads flocks. Mm-hmm. And this goes back to the cult of Pan. And we could talk about that a little bit. It does get a bit esoteric. There's a lot of ties back to mythology. Mm-hmm. But this is how the controllers roll. Yep. This is how they do things. So what happened was, when I first got into the whole Paul is dead research, I initially started with looking at the replacement of Paul McCartney. But then what happened was, I thought to myself, things just didn't happen, let's say, in September of 1966. So the story would say that Paul was killed in a car crash, and so then there was a mad rush to go find somebody who can replace him, somebody that looked like him, that plays like him, sings like him, that whole bit there. That's just a story, because there was no last-minute 11th hour rush to go find a replacement. Because what if you couldn't find a replacement? What were you going to do? And then the other thing was, why did they keep it a secret? The standard issue story says, well, the reason why they kept it a secret was because they didn't want to upset the fans, and they were concerned that some fans might hurt themselves or commit suicide because they were so in love with the Beatles and Paul McCartney. I'm not kidding you. Wow. This is some of the narrative that is around why they didn't, when I say they, I'm talking about the controllers, I'm talking about Tavistock, why they didn't announce that Paul McCartney died and they were going to replace him with somebody else in the band. It's a nonsense story, in my opinion. So what we have to do is we have to go back in time, and that's what I did. And this is where I catch a lot of flack by other people in the Paul is dead community and other researchers, because they don't want to touch the piece before he was swapped out, because many of them want to hold on to that story. I call it the Cinderella story, that the Beatles were organic, they evolved naturally, they were prolific genius songwriters. They want to hold on to that bit.
I ran into that. I told you that. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Mike, but I ran into that. And I was telling you that before we went live. I said, boy, I talked to somebody that really loves the Beatles, and I said, I told them that we were going to be talking about this, and they got upset that I even brought it up, that they weren't these great genius musicians at the beginning. And I was like, whoa, like, so I see where I can imagine when the heat you've gotten.
What Tavistock majors in, Rick, is creating cults. And their ability to create cults allows them and the controlling system to be able to manage the masses. If you believe something so stridently that you're not going to budge, that actually makes it easier for that person to be manipulated, because you know exactly how they're going to react to certain questions or situations or circumstances. So on top of creating cults, what they do is Tavistock looks to reduce the adult behavioral patterns, the critical thinking, down to that of a child. And you see this a lot, not just with the Beatles, but with other bands, where there is a romanticism that takes place with these bands. People are in love with their bands, they're in love with their artists, they're in love with their celebrities and their entertainers, their sports figures, their politicians, the Silicon Valley, quote, icons. Elon Musk as an example. People just fawn over these entertainers. And whenever you do that, when people do that, what they don't realize is what they're doing is they are worshiping. It's idol worship. Then there's a tendency to follow. Even if it's subconscious, they follow. So in the arena of the Beatles, you have this gigantic fan base, with many of them being very fanatical. And they will follow the band to the ends of the earth, even though the band is no longer in existence. And I'll explain more as to why that's so fitting, because I refer to the Beatles as the Pied Pipers of Aleister Crowley's Aeon of Horus. And when people worship and they idolize, what they do is they are going outside themselves. They're disempowering themselves, and they're giving up a level of their authority. Because now they're ripe to be told what to do, how to do it, when to do it. We saw this with the March 2020 event. You know, back then, I thought that a lot more people were awake than there actually were.
I did too. Yep.
I called it a complete hoax way back in March of 2020. And I just did not believe it was going to get legs. And then I was just shocked.
Me too.
How many people rolled up their sleeves, fell in line, and the rest is history.
That's what got me into what I'm doing, was how quickly I saw people roll over. And I've said it on this show. Any of my listeners know that I get going on this sometimes, because I'm like, how quickly like people forget is the thing that really gets to me too. Like, you know, we don't, you know, now you move, and I know they engineer it this way. They keep the next fear, bullet in the chamber, boom, and they just keep repeating,
right.
And it's the next fear. But I tell people, they shut the world down. Like, this is not this is the power of that. And I think they were putting a shot across the bow to see if they could get away with it. And I think even they were shocked. I really believe that. I think they were like, oh my God, they're actually going along with this. Like, I can't believe it worked.
Yeah, I just didn't think. I had to reset my barometer as to how many people were really awake.
Agreed.
And guess who was behind all of that, as far as the manipulation and the mind control and the brainwashing and the selling of the whole story? It was Tavistock. The controlling system is an international system. It knows no borders. It does not recognize national sovereignty. We have to understand that. All of the intelligence agencies across the world, especially what we refer to as the West, they all work together. So even though we'll talk about the CIA, and we'll talk about the British MI6, and we'll talk about the Israeli Mossad, even though they're separate entities on paper, they are, for all intents and purposes, one. Because they're all operating and working toward the same goals, the same agenda, which is a one world government with a one world religion. And the reason why I'm giving everybody this backdrop is because the Beatles played a very important role in getting that ball rolling. We'll go back in time. A lot of folks, a lot of Beatle fans, they think they know the beginnings of the Beatles, and that's because, they may have watched documentaries or they may have read books. These documentaries and most of these books are feeding you what I refer to as a Cinderella story. It's the official narrative. It's a fictional account of the Beatles' backstory. Now, are there threads of truth in it? Yes, there are threads of truth, because every lie, every deception has to have some truth.
A thread of it, yep.
Making its way through it, right, in order to keep it together and make it appear feasible. So, the Beatles wind up in Hamburg, Germany in August of 1960. Before that, they were known as the Quarrymen, and they were doing some gigs at the Casbah Club, which was in the house of Pete Best and his mother, Mona Best. But in August of 1960, they have a manager, and his name is Alan Williams. And Alan Williams, no relation to me, I refer to Alan as their first handler. So he takes them to Hamburg. Now, the other thing we should understand is Hamburg and Frankfurt in Germany are hotbeds for Tavistock. Okay, so that's the first thing we have to understand. Why Hamburg? And when the Beatles get to Hamburg, they are there from August 1960 to December of 1960, and it's a total failure. They get booked in these clubs. They're not very good. In fact, the way I describe it is, and I'm probably being very generous, they were mediocre at best as far as musicianship goes, and they showed absolutely no acumen for songwriting. So they weren't songwriters, and they weren't very good musicians. So we have to understand this. So they leave in December of 1960. They come home dejected. Nothing materialized. Nothing happened. It wasn't a good time. They were living in squalor while they were there. For a moment, let's just pause there. There are images on the internet of the Beatles with occult symbolism, engaging in occult symbolism, surrounded by occult symbolism. And one of those images are images of Paul McCartney and George Harrison with bird cages on their heads. And there's also an image of John Lennon in a Superman shirt with his head next to a bird cage. Now, bird cage symbolism in Illuminati speak is a reference to mind control, being a mind control slave. So we have to keep that in mind. So the whole birdcage thing, for me, raised a red flag. This tells me that it's very possible that the Beatles were in a mind control program from an early age. Now, how early? I don't know. But by having that symbolism out there, that's communicating out that there's a mind control program involved. That's where I landed with it.
Agreed. Yep.
Now, it gets even more interesting because when we take a look at the image of John Lennon with his head next to the birdcage, he's got a Superman shirt on. That's also now telling us about John Lennon being tied into a mind control program, but the Superman shirt is in reference to the Übermensch, the superhuman. And this is a philosophy and an ideology of the controllers. It's a philosophy and ideology of Aleister Crowley, of Nietzsche. So we've all heard Yuval Harari saying that they have gotten to the point now where they have evolved, or they're in a position of being godlike. They are gods now. So I hope most people have heard that nut job talk about this.
Yeah, I hope so.
So when we talk about the Übermensch, the superhuman, that is a reference to becoming godlike. And this is really one of the main tenets behind Crowley and his religion of Thelema, which I have deducted is the primary belief system, spiritual and philosophical belief system of the controllers. So if we think of the controllers as it being a pyramid, I call it the pyramid of power. I believe many of them, the majority of them, subscribe to Crowleyism, and it is a form of Luciferianism.
I totally agree. And it's really funny that I've talked to this about people, like I try to talk to people in person, Mike, and I talk to them about this, even online though I will. And some people snap right back and go, well, I don't believe in that. And I always tell them, I'm like, you may not believe in it, but they do. Like that is their religion. Like this is, they believe it. And I'm like, it doesn't matter if you believe in it. That's not the point.
People tell me that too. I don't believe in that stuff, and I don't believe this, and I don't
Hmm.
believe that. I don't believe in the power of numbers and all that. And I say, well, it doesn't matter what you believe because you don't run anything.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to be flip, but it's the truth. So the people who are in power, they have a belief system. They have an ideology. And their spiritual, for lack of a better term, belief system goes back to the Egyptian mysteries. And it goes back to Babylon, and as well as Greek mythology and other mysteries. But with Crowley specifically, he's clearly centered in the Egyptian mysteries
For sure.
and the Egyptian mythology of Osiris, Isis, Set, and Horus. So when Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum announced the Great Reset, it's the return of Set. And what does that mean? What they're looking to do when they say the return of Set, it's the return of chaos, it's the return of darkness. And now what's going to happen in their minds, okay, because this is the Egyptian mythology, there's going to be a battle between Set and the savior god, Horus. And this ties back to the Beatles. If we take a look at Peter Jackson's documentary that he did on Let It Be, the Get Back documentary going back a couple of years ago.
Yep. Yep.
If you take a look at the splash screen that Peter's team put together, it says Get Back, but take a look at the way the G is written, the font. It looks like an S. Set back, or Set is back. What they're doing is they're going through an alchemical process. This is what they're doing. And the elites, the controllers, whatever you want to call them, the Illuminati, they are driven by their belief system. It's another ism. The people behind the curtain are running the world based upon their spiritual and philosophical beliefs.
Hmm.
All right, so the reason why I wanted just to cover that a little bit. So now let's go back to the Beatles in the early days. So we've got the Beatles. Now they're young guys. In August of 1960, I think George is like 17 years old. Paul is 18 years old. John's a little older. Pete Best is there. There's no Ringo at this point in time. And so, they go through this 1960 period, August through December, and nothing materializes. John and Paul come back to Liverpool, dejected. And so then what happens is, they get into 1961, and they're doing these gigs. They're playing in Liverpool and in adjacent areas, and they're still not a very good band. They meet up with Brian Epstein on November 9th of 1961. So here we have another 11/9 or 9/11 encoded date or event.
Yeah.
From that point on, let's just take November of 1961, move forward now 2 months. They wind up with a demo with Decca Records on January 1st of 1962. I need the audience just to stop and think about this, and especially if you are a musician and a songwriter and you're in a band. I want you to think through this. They show up in August of 1960 in Hamburg. They're not very good musicians. They're not songwriters. Then, 16 months later, they wind up at Decca doing an audition.
That doesn't make sense. Okay.
15 songs, 12 of which are covers, and then they did 3 originals, nondescript originals, which never made their way. The originals never made their way onto any of their albums when they were together as a band, as a unit. The songs didn't make it onto an album until later on when Anthology was released in the 1990s. So they do this tape, this demo with Decca, and Decca turns them down. Decca says, no, we're not going to sign you. A month later, in February, their manager, Brian Epstein, they have a new manager now. It's no longer Alan Williams. He takes tapes to George Martin, and George Martin worked for EMI. And George Martin was the head of the Parlophone label. So Parlophone was part of EMI. And so Brian Epstein plays the tapes for George Martin, and George Martin, I'll read you exactly what he said. He says to Brian Epstein, if you want me to judge them based on what you are playing me, I'm sorry, I need to turn you down. So what's interesting is now they've been turned down twice, by Decca and by EMI. Then mysteriously what happens is they are then doing performances for the BBC. Now we have to take a step back and say, okay, now hold on a second. You weren't a very good band. You weren't writing songs. 16 months later, you wind up at Decca doing a demo. Okay, they turned you down. Then you go to EMI. You play tapes for George Martin. Martin turns you down. And then somehow you wind up connected into the BBC and you're doing the live at the BBC sessions. Well, how did that happen?
Yeah, that doesn't, yeah.
Okay, so the other thing we should know about the live at the BBC sessions, they were not live. So for those of you that have the CDs and you think you're listening to live performances, you are not. It's documented in mainstream sources that those sessions, they did takes and they did overdubs. And then the shows were released a couple of weeks down the line.
Oh, okay.
I don't even believe the Beatles were playing on those BBC sessions that we're hearing on the CDs. Session players with the Beatles doing the vocals, but we can get into that in a little bit. So then what happens is, so now the Beatles are starting their BBC gigs, and that runs through, I think it was mid-1965. And while they're doing that, they're also continuing to play night after night after night after night. If it wasn't in Hamburg for weeks on end, they were doing local gigs around Liverpool and the adjacent areas. So they were getting all of these gigs. So another question is, how were they getting all of these gigs? And if you take a look into Wikipedia and you type in the Beatles live shows, you're going to see that it was just about every night. They had a couple of breaks here and there, but it was just bam, 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 bam. It just kept going. So they're doing that. They're doing the BBC gigs. Now, this is a band that was turned down twice by Decca and EMI.
Yeah.
So then in June of 1962, they are signed by EMI. George Martin had a change of heart. So 4 months prior, George said no. And then 4 months later, he's like, okay. Now, in the book, it tells us that George Martin was instructed to reverse his decision and sign the band. Now, the question becomes, who made the phone call to George to tell him wrong answer? I'll give you a little bit of backstory. George reported to a guy by the name of Len Wood. And Len Wood and George Martin, ultimately reported up to the chairman of EMI, Sir Joseph Lockwood. Now, when I did the research on this, I wanted to understand, why was George Martin's decision reversed? George Martin wasn't just a producer, folks. He was the head of the Parlophone label. He was promoted to head the Parlophone label in 1955 when Oscar Prius resigned. Now, some people are under the belief, because this is what the official narrative tells us, that George Martin he was doing classical records and he was doing comedy records like with Peter Sellers and the Goons and stuff like that. And he didn't know anything about rock and roll and yada, 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 yada. That's not true. When George Martin took over the Parlophone label, he was looking to bring in current acts, which means rock and roll. He was looking to bring rock and roll to the label.
Yeah.
Because he's heading up the label, right? He doesn't want the label to die on the vine with comedy records and classical music. So that whole bit where people are told that he didn't know anything about rock and roll and the Beatles taught him rock and roll, that's not true, based upon my research.
Okay.
George was way ahead of the curve, looking for acts to bring in so that he could pump up the label and have an inventory of artists. Now, what happened in 1962 is the Beatles recorded two songs, Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You. And his immediate boss, George Martin, his immediate boss was Len Wood. There was some tension between the two of them. And Len told George to sign the band, and I'll give you my opinion on this. I believe Len Wood had the bigger picture understood as far as where the Beatles were going. So he told George Martin, look, sign them. And Len Wood was looking to flow the publishing rights, at the very least for the first two songs, which were recorded in 1962, Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You, to EMI's publishing arm. Because there's going to be a lot of money if you own the publishing rights to the Beatles' music. So even though they were starting with the first two songs, I believe it's possible Len knew what was coming. He was in on the overall strategy of where the band was going to be taken. George Martin signs it, but then George Martin does not lead the Beatles publishing to EMI. I want to say this carefully because I don't want to make it sound like George Martin was behind this, but he was having discussions with Brian Epstein about forming a different publishing company, like a standalone publishing company, which became Northern Songs. And Northern Songs came in under the umbrella of Dick James Music, which was a huge publisher back in the day. Now, why did George Martin do this, right? So George Martin was having issues with EMI because he didn't feel he was being compensated properly. He had compensation concerns, and he would voice them periodically with Len Wood. So again, this is conjecture on my part, folks. I'm speculating because I haven't found anything that spells out exactly why it is there was this change in decision from not signing them to signing them. So I think what happened was there was a little tit for tat going back and forth between Len Wood and George Martin. So George said, okay, fine, we'll sign him. But the publishing didn't go to EMI. And by the way, between Dick James and Brian Epstein, they took a huge piece of the publishing at that point. So that's a little bit of a backdrop. So George is told, you got to take them on. George, he signs them. But here's the other kicker. When the Beatles show up, George Martin doesn't work with them immediately. He assigns it to his assistant, Ron Richards. So George is still not touching the band. In Memoirs, it tells us that Ron Richards spends time with the Beatles in the studio, and he really couldn't get anything out of them. They were not studio savvy. They just weren't very good musicians. So they listened to the playback, and it was at that point, again, this is spelled out in Memoirs, George Martin gets another phone call and says, okay, look, there's no delegation on this. You have got to work with this band directly. Now, Ron Richards, so everybody knows, Ron later went on to produce the Hollies. So Ron was, he wasn't a slacker. Ron was very capable. But, George Martin was told, okay, you need to work with them directly. So what I want to do now is, so we're up to June of 1962. And what I want to do is just read you some quotes from George Martin.
Okay.
Now, before I do that, there was a Mersey Beat article going back to August, September of 1962. In that article, it announced that Pete Best was out, Ringo was in as the drummer. But in that article, it also says this, and I'll read directly from the article. The Beatles will fly to London to make recordings at EMI Studios. They will be recording numbers that have been specifically written for the group, which they have received from the recording manager, George Martin.
That's interesting.
So let me read that again, folks. They will be recording numbers that have been specifically written for them. Not by them, for them. So George Martin is looking for music that they can record. Why is that? In the 1980s documentary, The Complete Beatles, it tells us that John Lennon and Paul McCartney, between the two of them, whether individually or as a team, between 1956 and 1962, wrote 100 songs between them. They didn't record them, but they wrote 100 songs between 1956 and 1962. Yet, when they get signed by EMI, apparently they didn't have any songs to bring to George Martin, or if they had songs, George Martin deemed them as not good enough.
Not good enough, yeah.
To be recorded, right? So Here are some other things that George said. On meeting the Beatles in 1962, he said, I wasn't terribly impressed with the first stuff they did. In a documentary that is titled Produced by George Martin, there is a scene where George Martin is speaking to Howard Goodall. Howard Goodall is a composer and a broadcaster. He's a very accomplished composer. And George says to Howard, they had this wonderful charisma. They made you feel good, but I thought their music was rubbish. And then in another interview, he says that even though they had really nothing behind them, now remember, George is saying they had nothing behind them, but the documentary says that they had 100 songs written between them between 56 and 62. And George Martin is saying they had nothing behind them, but they were still fairly irreverent. And then he goes on to say, so I looked at these four guys and I thought none of them shines above all the others. So nobody stood out. He said, Love Me Do is the best song I could find from them at the time. I was very conscious it was not the big hit I was looking for. And then in another interview, he says that they certainly had no, and then he pauses for a second because he's measuring his words. He says, it wasn't too obvious they can be songwriters at this stage. Love Me Do was the best thing they had. So this is coming out of the mouth of George Martin.
Right, right.
So back in the day, between their first UK release, Please Please Me, and Rubber Soul, their sound engineer was a gentleman by the name of Norman Smith. So in 1971, in a music magazine called the New Musical Express, in the article, Norman Smith says the following things. He was not impressed at all. They were awful. He had doubts about their musical ability. With regard to recording Love Me Do, he said we had some hard times working on that one. And he said in the article that they failed in the studio. Now, in that article, what he then does, which is something that we see a lot in the Beatle narrative, you'll have these unflattering things said, and then they move to kind of like they want to prop up the story.
Okay.
So they move to a more flattering line of discussion, and then Norman goes on to say that the Beatles talked their way into a contract. Now, between you and me, Rick, nobody talks their way into a contract.
Nope.
Right?
Exactly.
Either you have it or you don't.
Yep.
Then he goes on to say they had so much personality and so much magic about them. And the word magic is very important. If we get an opportunity to talk more about Crowley, we'll understand why. When you look at the Beatles narrative and you really investigate and dig into the official narrative, the official story, some of the stuff is just, it borders on ludicrous. So, as an example, we're told that for the Beatles' first album, UK release, their official releases, by the way, were their UK albums, not the capital releases in the US. They tell us that in February of 1963, the Beatles recorded 10 of the 14 songs in their first album in one day, in one long session.
Wow, okay.
10 of the 14 songs were recorded in one day. But here's the kicker. Norman Smith goes on to say that we did their first album, Please Please Me, in one take. In one take. I'm going to tell you right now, I have been a musician for a long time, a songwriter for quite a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very familiar with the recording process, very familiar with writing songs, the music, the lyrics, and so on. 10 songs, bang, 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 bang in one take.
That doesn't even sound plausible.
Right?
Yeah.
So then he goes on to say we did the whole album in a day. That's how we did it back then. But we have to remember now, I just read you this piece, folks, right? But if we go back to what he also said in the article, he was not impressed with them. They were awful. They had a hard time getting Love Me Do down, and they failed in the studio. So this is what we're talking about. This is what I refer to as the unofficial story around the Beatles. So we have this whole backdrop here, and then what happens is in March of 1963, they release their first album, Please Please Me. So remember now, they get signed in June of 1962, and then a mere 9 months later, from a band that had nothing behind them, that their producer felt like he needed to go find songs for them,
they make an album.
They make an album.
Wow.
So this band that had nothing behind them, now they have these 8 original songs in the bag on the first album, Please Please Me. And by the way, it was released on March 22nd of 1963. March 22nd is 322. It's the Skull and Bones number. Fast forward, then we get to their second album, With the Beatles. That's released in November. So 8 months after Please Please Me is released, in November of 1963, and it was on November 22nd of 1963, which is the same day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And November 22nd is 11 and 22, which is 33.
Another occult number.
Another occult number, okay? On that album, another 8 original songs and 6 covers. So between the first 2 albums, we have a band that didn't have any songs. They weren't very good musicians. And now all of a sudden, there are 16 songs that we're told that they wrote, originals, for the first 2 albums. And then when we move forward to the third album, A Hard Day's Night, There's 13 tracks on A Hard Day's Night, and we're told that all 13 tracks were penned by the Beatles. No covers. Once you dig into it, there should be a lot of questions.
For sure. Right.
So now, just to give you some time frames, just to put it into perspective, okay? And let me see here. Let me just get there. Okay. So let's just use Hamburg as a stake in the ground. August of 1960. So here is some elapsed time analysis. From Hamburg to the Decca audition, 1 year and 4 months, 20 days, 16 months. Remember, they started as nothing. Hamburg to the EMI contract in June of 1962, 1 year and 10 months. Hamburg to their first release, Please Please Me, their first UK album, 2 years and 7 months. Hamburg to With the Beatles, 3 years and 3 months. Here's something I think people really need to get their heads wrapped around. Starting with the starting point being August of 1960 in Hamburg, and then landing in the United States on February 7th of 1964 is 3 years and 5 months. So the Beatles went from zero to hero in 3.5 years. From Hamburg to landing in America. And by the way, when they came to America, the tagline for that was, "The Beatles conquer America."
Yep.
The British invasion. So when we talk about the British invasion, think in terms of Tavistock. The Tavistock invasion. The Beatles conquer America. It was very important for the world order, the New World Order, for the deep state, however you want to refer to them, whatever label you want to give them, the control system, to be able to take control of the United States and to take down traditional values, and especially they had institutionalized religion on the radar too, and specifically Christianity.
Right.
So Christianity was in the crosshairs. Christianity had to be taken down along with the traditional values that permeated the United States. So the Beatles were all part of that, and a lot of people struggle with that because they say, well, I don't know, I mean, I like the Beatles' music, and they were these 4 mop-top lads. I mean, well, what you have to understand is the way Tavistock operates is it's incremental and it's methodical. So they had to start very basic. Now, understand also that when the Beatles were in Hamburg, they weren't in suit and ties. They were dressed in leather.
That's interesting, too. Yeah.
Yeah. So when Brian Epstein got them, he cleaned them up. Like he threw them in the shower, scrubbed them up, said, here, right? Here, wear, here's a white shirt, a tie, here's some Beatle boots, and here's a suit, and this is how we're going to move forward until we got to later, towards 65, 66, especially when we get to 1967 with the release of Sgt. Pepper. That's when everything changed drastically. But there were still changes between 62 and 66. The Beatles released 2 albums a year from 1963 through 1966.
Jeez. So
they were on the hook for 2 a year, in the early part of the year, and then another album later in the year in time for Christmas. So in 63, it was Please Please Me and With the Beatles. In 64, it was A Hard Day's Night and Beatles for Sale. In 1965, it was Help, and it was Rubber Soul. And then in 1966, it was Revolver. And then they released a, quote, greatest hits album. And I don't know if we're going to be able to get into this too much, but it was really a transitional album. It was called A Collection of Oldies.
Okay.
So here we had a situation where in the latter part of 1966, they released an album called A Collection of Oldies for songs that only dated back 3 years. Why would you refer to a song that was recorded 3 years ago or 2 years ago or a year ago as an oldie?
Doesn't make sense. Yeah.
Well, the reason for that is because Paul McCartney was gone at the end of Revolver. So Revolver was released on August 5th of 1966. He passed away on September 11th of 1966. And so they had to put a second album out. So what they did was they put this transitional album out, A Collection of Oldies, which was a, quote, greatest hits album. And that was the segue, the bridge between Revolver and Sgt. Pepper. And Sgt. Pepper was Billy's album. That was Billy and George Martin working together.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, Billy, when I talk about Billy, folks, I'm talking about the guy that's playing Paul McCartney today. He's the guy that's had the primary contract to play Paul McCartney since 1966 to current day. So when we think in terms of Paul McCartney, the actual biological Paul was there from 62 to 66. If we just separate out the Hamburg days, I'm talking about when the Beatles were popular,
Right.
for 4 years. And then from 1966 to 2024, that's Billy. So that's why so many people have a hard time with this too, because the guy that they have been looking at for almost 60 years is the replacement.
Right.
Okay? By the way, Tavistock also was putting out images that included doubles and lookalikes. I was told by a source that from the very beginning, there were 3 doubles and or lookalikes for each Beatle right out of the gate. And doubles and lookalikes were used throughout the Beatles' timeline and also into their solo career. I have a clip. It's a dialogue between Mike Campbell and Benmont Tench from Tom Petty's band, the Heartbreakers. And it's just Mike and Benmont speaking, and they're talking about how Ringo sent a double to one of their recording sessions. And they were laughing. They said, this guy looks just like him. They were saying that when Ringo can't or doesn't want to do gigs or be at a certain event, he taps his double to go make the trip. Now, this is not me telling you that this happened. I have the clip on my YouTube channel, and you can listen to Mike Campbell and Benmont Tench of the Heartbreakers have a discussion about their experience with Ringo's double. And the book tells us Billy still uses a double to this day. That's some of the background that a lot of people don't know about.
That's fascinating.
The Beatles were not writing music in that early period. They were not writing music in Hamburg. Their Hamburg stints, they were playing like 7 hours a night. In an interview I have with Pete Best, going back many years ago, Pete said that when they were in Hamburg, they would show up at the venue, at the bar or the club at 6 p.m., and they would play for 7 hours a night. They would then head back to wherever they were sleeping, wherever they were hanging out. In the very early days back in the 1960s, they were in an old vacated cinema. That's where they were hanging their hat at night after the gigs. When I mentioned before, they were living in squalor. That's really what it was. It got better as they were being handled and groomed going through 61 into 1962, but they weren't writing music. So what Hamburg and their live gigs in Liverpool and areas adjacent to Liverpool, what that was all about was that was boot camp.
That makes sense.
That was to get the Beatles to learn to be better musicians, not great musicians. In fact, in a June 1966 interview at the Hilton in Japan, Paul McCartney is asked about their songwriting and their musicianship, and he says that we never claimed to be great musicians. We're adequate.
That's him saying that.
That's him saying that. Now, what we have to keep in mind is in August of 1966, in June of 1966, I should say. There's another interview in August of 1966 I'll talk about in a minute. In June of 1966, they were just wrapping up the recording of Revolver, which is considered a seminal record, along with Rubber Soul and even Help. And for one of the main songwriters, Paul McCartney, to say that they were adequate, I mean, that doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't.
How could you have all of that under your belt? 7 albums at that moment in time. Please Please Me through Revolver. And then just say that, we aren't very good musicians. We never claimed to be, and we're adequate. It just doesn't resonate. It doesn't make sense. In an August 5th, 1966 interview, that was the day that Revolver was released. In that interview, he said that they were limited as a group. They were not very good musically. And he also made a comment. The Cinderella story tells us that the Beatles were writing music all the time. They were writing when they had their free time. They were writing when they were on tour. They were writing when they were filming movies. They were writing when they were in the recording studio. And in the August 5th, 1966 interview with the BBC, Paul McCartney states that the Beatles wrote in great big batches whenever they had to go in to do a record or a film. So he was saying that they were writing in great big batches. They were writing 12, 14, 16 songs in big batches. And during that interview, the BBC interviewer He came across like he didn't even kind of believe that statement because he said, I always thought it was quite impossible to sit down and write 12 songs in a great big batch.
Yeah, from scratch? Wow. Try writing a song, people. Like, I mean, I'm a musician now and I play with musicians, and try hashing out a song. Never mind that many. It's not easy. Like, it's not.
But the most important thing, Rick, about what Paul said, and it's coming from the horse's mouth, is Paul took the official narrative, which says that they were writing all the time. They were writing when they were eating breakfast, when they were on the crapper. It didn't matter where they were always writing on the back of napkins and all of this stuff. And he said, that's not true. We wrote in great big batches. He took the official narrative and he just blew it out of the sky.
Yep, exactly.
But he presented another problem when he said that, because the problem he presented is, okay, so how is that done? How do you write 12, 14, 16 songs in a very, very short period of time? How do you do that?
That's a good question.
And that was never explained. In fact, when the BBC interviewer questioned the feasibility of writing 12 songs, just sitting down at a time, and said that it seems impossible, John said, well, it is at times quite impossible. So the point is that within the mainstream information that's out there about the Beatles, the truth is actually out there. But it's hidden in plain sight. It's what we see all the time with many, many conspiracies. You just have to read between the lines. You have to look under certain covers, under certain hoods, and you'll find information that you're really not supposed to know. But when you find it, if you're intrepid enough, you start to ask questions. So with me, what happened was I want to move to if you don't mind, Rick, to why I concluded that they did not write all their own music.
Absolutely. I was going to ask you. So, yeah, perfect.
Yeah, so let me just take everybody through that. So what happened was I was reading memoirs. There was a passage it began on page 350 in one of the previous editions. I think the book has been updated 4 or 5 times. And the paragraph said that George Martin was going to take their little songs and make them great. So I thought to myself, well, they're supposed to be prolific genius songwriters. What is this bit about their little songs? And George Martin was going to make them great. And then the next page segues to the Committee of 300. And it mentions the snitch. The snitch was John Coleman. Coleman was a former intelligence officer with British intelligence, the British military. He turned whistleblower. And so in his Committee of 300 book, he talks about Tavistock creating the Beatles and the music being written for them. And the person that he mentions that wrote the music was Theodore Adorno. And Theodore Adorno was out of the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School is about 6 hours drive from Hamburg. And the Frankfurt School is connected at the hip to Tavistock.
Right. Yep.
So now, I don't agree with Coleman, Dr. Coleman, with all due respect, that Theodore Adorno wrote all of the music. I believe that Theodore Adorno was in an oversight capacity. He was overseeing this psychological operation, this social engineering project titled The Beatles. And he was working together with George Martin. The other thing also I should mention that EMI, the label EMI, has connections back to the British military-industrial complex. So I believe it was Theodore Adorno and George Martin that were the managing directors. I think George was the managing director and Adorno was in an oversight capacity, reporting into the Frankfurt School in Tavistock to put this whole thing together. So, and I'll get into more of this in a moment, but what happened was, so I got the clues out of the book and I'm like, what is this book telling me? Mm-hmm. I think it's telling me that I should look into whether they wrote their music, all their own music. So sometimes, these synchronistic events take place in your life, Rick. And for me, I came across a series by Scott Fryman, and it's called Deconstructing the Beatles. And what Scott does, he's a musicologist, he's a composer himself. He has he's a very solid resume, but he presents the Beatles' official narrative. I'm not knocking Scott for that. That's what he does.
Okay.
On a lark, a little bird whispered in my ear and said, get the Rubber Soul series, the Rubber Soul episode of the series.
Okay.
of the deconstructing. So I call it deconstructing Rubber Soul. So I get the DVD. I buy it off of Amazon. And I get like 15, 20 minutes into it, Rick. And it's saying that the Beatles came in with essentially no backlog of music. They had to write 16 songs from scratch in the studio, 14 for the album, and 2 for a double A-side single. And they had to do this. They had to write both the music and lyrics. They had to learn the songs. So in other words, if John and Paul wrote a song, or if George wrote a song, they had to bring it to the other band members so that they can learn the song. Hey guys, this is how the song goes. What do you think? Then they had to rehearse the songs. And then once you introduce a song to the band, there's a give and take.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
There's an ebb and flow about how this song should play out.
Absolutely. Yep.
Maybe the verse should change. Maybe we should add a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Hey, maybe we should extend the bridge. Maybe it doesn't need a bridge. How about the chorus sounds a little more like this? Let's add some keyboards.
I'm just smiling because with the people I jam with, you're so right. Like you bring it and this discussion goes on for hours. Like add this, pull this, try this.
So we're to believe that the Beatles wrote, learned, rehearsed, arranged, recorded, and mixed 16 brand new songs from scratch in 30 days. They came into the studio on October 11th of 1965 to record Rubber Soul. The recording started on the next day, October 12th, but they were in the studio on October 11th, according to Scott Fryman. And they finished up on November 11th into the wee hours of the night, actually in the early morning hours of November 12th.
Mm-hmm.
So on November 11th, we're told that they finished up recording 4 songs in one long session. 2 of those songs, we're told, didn't even exist prior to November 11th, the last day of recording. The 2 songs that were, allegedly written on November 11th and recorded on that day, not only just recorded, but written, learned, rehearsed, recorded, was You Won't See Me and Girl. They finished up I'm Looking Through You, which we're told that they started on November 6th. So 5 days later, on November 11th, they finish up I'm Looking Through You. And then we're told that to finish off the album with 7 songs on each side, a 14-track album, they brought us the song Wait in, the basic rhythm tracks, from the Help sessions earlier in the year. So they added some overdubs and vocals to that. Now, I'm going to say that doing that 4 songs, I don't even care if you brought one in from earlier in the year, if you still had to do overdubs and vocals, to get all of that done within 13 hours or whatever in a single day is not possible.
I'm with you on that one.
It's not possible. So, I had a couple of friends of mine. We did a show a number of months back. We discussed how the whole process works when you're putting a song together. One of the examples I use is, when I record, I might go through 4 or 5 guitars to get the right sound. I might check out a half a dozen amps to get the right amp sound. I might try different effects to make sure I get exactly what it is that I have in my head, because that's how it works. You have something in your head, and you want to take what's in your head and you want to be able to represent that audibly. And that's, that's really the basis of when you're songwriting and you're recording. Now, the other thing, too, what this says is that everything they touched, every song they started, they completed. That means not only the music, but the lyrics. It means they never stumbled, Rick.
Oh, okay.
It says they never had any false starts. So let me just take the folks through the calendar a little bit. I'm not going to go through the whole thing because we're getting really short on time here. But so they arrived at EMI. 1 day later, they wrote, rehearsed, recorded, and completed Run for Your Life. The second day in, they nailed Drive My Car. Wrote the music, the lyrics, rehearsed it, had it in the bag 2 days after they arrived in the studio. They had Day Tripper nailed down on day 5. If I Needed Someone on day 7. Norwegian Wood on day 10. In My Life and Nowhere Man were both completed on the same day, 11 days in, on October 22nd. And we can work it out. 18 days in was in the bag on October 29th. And so I'm not going to go through November, but it's the same pattern in November.
Right.
So what we're seeing here is a conveyor belt. And writing music, lyrically and musically, is not a conveyor belt process.
Well, that makes a lot, like, that's what I hope people listening understand is it's one thing if you're a band and you're out in the circuit and you're developing, which most bands do. They tour, they do little bar gigs, they're honing their craft. That's why a lot of bands have an amazing first album. They have their whole life to craft it. And the point is they go into the studio and they have a lot of it hammered out. They're just doing, they do some fine tuning and stuff like that. But what you're talking about is going into a studio with nothing.
Nothing.
And writing it and doing what you're saying. That is a feat that is astronomical.
A point I brought up a number of times in my presentations is I mentioned earlier that the Beatles were on the hook for 2 albums a year, right?
That's a lot of music. Wow.
So when we take a look at 1963, they had their 2 albums, Please Please Me with the Beatles, and the Beatles had a very, very hectic schedule. But they still had time to write 16 original songs for those first 2 albums. Then we get to 1964, and that's really when Beatlemania really kicked into high gear. So now the Beatles are doing worldwide tours in 1964. They did a movie. A Hard Day's Night was sandwiched in between the recording period for the album of A Hard Day's Night. So not only were they in a period of time when they were recording the album, but they were also on a movie set filming a movie. And they were touring, and they were doing news conferences, and guess what? They came up with 13 original songs for A Hard Day's Night and 8 songs for Beatles for Sale. That's 21 original songs in that hectic period. And then as we get to 1965, Help is their first album in 65. Touring slows down a little bit beginning in 1965, but again, when they had the period of time when they were recording Help, they were also on the set to film the movie Help. And we're told that John Lennon wrote the song, I think it was Wait, on the movie set of Help. But I have an interview that was published in The Independent going back a number of years ago where John Lennon said that they were in a haze of marijuana the whole time that they were filming the movie Help.
I remember that. Yeah.
They were basically useless by the time they got to lunch. And the director of the film, Richard Lester, knew he had to try to get everything as much as he possibly could, as much filming as he possibly could into the earlier part of the day, because once they hit midday,
it was all she wrote.
They were so stoned, they were useless. But we're told that they wrote 12 songs for Help. It was a 14-track album, 12 were originals, and there were 2 covers. And then something happened, Rick. Everybody fell asleep. Everybody nodded off at the wheel because nobody was checking in with anybody about how they were coming along with songs for Rubber Soul.
Okay.
You see the point I'm making?
Yes.
So with all this busy schedule and everything that they were doing in 63, 64, and the beginning of 65, somehow they still found time to write music, we're told, allegedly.
Mm-hmm.
But then it goes dark. Brian Epstein, I mean, he didn't contact John Lennon and Paul McCartney or even George Harrison and say, hey guys, how are we doing with the songs? How many do you have? Because I have, and George Martin, we have studio time booked in October at EMI Studios, and we're going to need 16 songs.
Mm-hmm.
14 for the album,
Yep.
2 for a single. So I hope you guys are banging out tunes. Evidently, that conversation never took place. Nor, evidently, did it take place between George Martin and the band. The producer of the band, he doesn't inquire about how they're coming along
Right,
with songs.
I would be.
So
Yeah.
what happened was before they entered the studio on October 11th of 1965, 6 weeks before that, they were on their U.S. tour. The U.S. tour ends on August 31st, and then they have a 6-week break before they go into the studio. And some people want to claim that they wrote the 16 songs or whatever number of songs people want to say they wrote. Because some people want to argue and say, oh, they had some songs in the bag. I say, okay, look, you know what? I'm not going to argue this. Pick the number of songs, 10, 12, 14. That's still a ton of songs that you have to write from scratch and that you have to nail down within 30 days. I say 16 because I don't believe they came in with anything, and I'll explain why in a moment.
Okay.
So people want to say, oh, well, they were writing while they were on holiday between when the tour ended and when they had to show up EMI on October 11th of 65. The problem with that is the official narrative tells us that's not what they were doing during their holiday. In fact, in one of Mark Lewison's books, I have two of his books, he clearly states that that period of time, that 6 weeks between when the tour ended and when they had to go into the studio to record Rubber Soul, the Beatles were on vacation. They were on holiday with no work. And if people want to argue that writing songs is not work, I'm going to tell you, try it. Yep. It's work, okay? Yep. Getting your band together, writing songs, rehearsing, going back and forth. And let me tell you, many times personalities clash. There could be arguments. That's the life of being in a band, folks. Mm-hmm. For those of you who have never been in a band, I'm telling you from experience, that's how it works. And you can get these stories from many, many other bands. In fact, many of the bands that you follow, there'll be stories like this where they were at each other. Look at the Kinks.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? They're a classic example. So what happened was I said, well, this makes no sense to me. Like I said, this is conveyor belt stuff. And so we go back to the August 5th, 66 interview, and John Lennon and Paul McCartney said that it's a bit of a drag for the first two songs. They're talking about writing music. They said the last LP, and I believe they were talking about Revolver because they did the interview when Revolver was released on August 5th. We took weeks just trying to get one song written. So if it took you weeks to get one song written for Revolver, how did you write 16 songs in weeks? Because what's 30 days? 30 days is 4 weeks.
Yep.
And then in that same interview, Paul said we're limited as a group. We're the first to say we're not all that good musically. The other thing with the Rubber Soul sessions is not one song took more than 5 takes to record the basic rhythm tracks.
Jeez.
Now remember, they came in with nothing, Rick.
Yeah.
Every song was 5 takes or less to nail the basic rhythm tracks. If we fast forward to the White Album sessions in 1968, I mean, you could take a look at Mark Lewison's books. Dozens of takes to get those songs done. 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. I think it was 100 takes to get the song Not Guilty recorded, which never made it onto a Beatle album. George released it as a solo song. So we're talking about dozens and dozens of takes 3 years later. So we have to ask the question, well, what happened to your studio prowess?
I was just going to ask
that. Yeah. In 65, you can do this stuff in less than 5 takes.
You're getting worse.
You're getting worse. You're going backwards.
Yep.
Well, the truth of the matter is they weren't going backwards. It's the Rubber Soul story is total fiction. So the other thing with the 30 days is there were 6 days when there was no recording scheduled due to fan club obligations. That was 1 day. There was mixing within the 30 days. That was 2 days. They stepped out for a day to receive their MBEs. And they also stepped out for 2 days to do a TV special. So in October, they did 8 songs. They were recorded in 18 days in a total of 28 takes for all songs. So 8 songs in 18 days, no more than 28 takes for all 8 songs, which is an average of 3.5 takes per song. In November, they finished the other 8 songs. Remember, there were 16 songs, 14 for the album, 2 for the single, right? They did that in 13 days, in 5 less days than they did in October. In a total of 14 takes, which is 1.8 takes per song. And if somebody wants to argue, well, they brought weight in, so there were really no basic rhythm track takes, then we can say that the average was for November 2 takes per song. If I back weight out. Either way, it's not feasible. It's not reality.
It's not reality. No.
So 16 songs in 31 days with in a total of 42 takes for all of the songs, averaging 2.6 takes per song. 8 songs were started and completed on the same day, and 4 songs were completed on the very last day. I took everybody through that on November 11th, which is, in my view, an impossible task. So that's one problem with Rubber Soul, and there's another problem with the manufacturing process that I won't get into right now because we're really
I know. I'm going to have to ask you, Mike. I hope you can come back and do a part 2.
Yes.
I would love to schedule that for in a few weeks if you're available. I know you're really busy, but I would love for you to, because we haven't even got into Tavistock and Aleister Crowley. We're just building this foundation. So I really hope we can do a part 2. I would love to have you back.
No, we'll definitely do a part 2, Rick. And I knew that we were going to have a lot of difficulty getting all of this in 2 hours. That's the thing with this. I've been at this for 8 years. There is so much. Yep. I mean, I can talk about Tavistock and Aleister Crowley for 2 hours.
That's why I was going to go with part 2. Like, I'm glad we're building this foundation because, believe me, for all the listeners, this all ties in. What we're building here is very important to when we do part 2. So that's why I wanted to build this strong foundation, because then we can get into how they work. Like, I can see it, but people that haven't looked into what we know might not see what's happening, but I can see what's happening. So, and Tavistock and the Committee of 300 and is a very detrimental in what we're talking about. So this is important, this part.
But let me just, I'll give everybody the punchline, because I'm sure people are saying, well, Mike, you know, like, well, how did it get done? Because the album it was released. Right. So how was it done? The way it was done, folks, is that all of the songs were pre-written by ghostwriters, songwriters, and they were recorded by session musicians. While the Beatles were out doing their tours, doing their films, and doing everything that they did publicly, behind the scenes, George Martin was pulling the music together. He pulled the studio musicians together. They recorded the instrumental tracks. And so the Beatles' job when they came in to the studio was to sing the vocals. So when Paul McCartney said that they wrote in great big batches, I believe what Paul McCartney was really saying was they had to learn the vocals in great big batches. So when the Beatles showed up at the studio on October 11th, George Martin already had the instrumental tracks recorded, and I'm sure there was a guide vocal so that they could listen to it, and then they could learn the vocals, they could learn the melodies, work on the harmonies. That's what they did for 30 days. That's what I concluded was the process for the Beatles from 1962 through 1966, and even going into the 67 to 70 period, although during the Billy period, 67 through 70, the Beatles, John Lennon and George Harrison in particular, were writing more of their own material and playing on more of the recorded tracks, but ghost writers and session players were still being utilized right through 1970.
That makes sense to me, yeah.
So that's the punchline. And by the way, if people think that that's a strange concept, I recommend a couple of, actually 3 documentaries you should watch. The Wrecking Crew. Watch The Wrecking Crew. That's how records got made. Pop records got made in the 1960s and the 1970s. And in England, they had their version of The Wrecking Crew with people like Vic Flick, Big Jim Sullivan. Also watched the documentary Hired Gun.
That one's great. Yeah.
Yeah, Hired Gun picks up where The Wrecking Crew leaves off. So from the 1980s on, you'll see how these session players, they're the people that are on those tracks. In fact, if you watch Hired Gun, I have to watch it again, it tells us that on the Aerosmith albums, it wasn't Joe Perry on some of those tracks. And the last one, and because I know we're really
we got like 30 seconds, so let's...
Muscle Shoals. Watch Muscle Shoals, and that is
amazing.
Another documentary. Wow. Must watch.
Thank you so much, Mike. I'm already looking forward to part 2. I will set that up, guys. I will have Mike back, I promise. And we're going to dive into this even deeper, and it's going to be a must listen. Mike, where can they find all your work in that? I want you to have the last 30 seconds.
Okay, my hub website, Sage of Quay, SAGEOFQUAY.com. It's all of my links are there.
Perfect.
All of my platforms. You can hit my music there. Lots and lots of stuff there. So it's one-stop shop.
That's amazing. And thank you guys so much for tuning in. As I said, a listener made this happen by a request. Please reach out to me if there's guests you want. And I will have Mike back for part 2 as soon as I can set it up, guys. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for sticking around. And I will see you next Monday, guys. Have a great week. And thank you once again, Mike. Amazing. Welcome back, Mike. I'm excited, as you can tell, to have you here. Thank you so, so much for taking time to come and do part 2 with me. I've been looking forward to this one.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you for having me back. So did you have a lot of backlash from the the first show?
Yeah, like not backlash from the show. It was because the information that I've been learning. And then I kind of talked to fans. I have a few musician friends that are really big Beatles fans. And it's really weird that when you start questioning anything about their songwriting or their musicianship in the early days, like when we were talking about in Germany and stuff like that, they get really defensive. Like, no, they were always amazing. They were always great artists. They were always this. They were always that. And I'm just like, I'm not saying that they didn't become great. I never said that. I don't think anyone has. But I'm saying they're not, they were kind of built. And then they really got upset.
Yeah, well, they were not great when they started.
I know.
You don't have to take my word for it. For those who believe that and are listening, all you need to do is go back and listen to the interviews that the Beatles themselves, especially the guy that's playing Paul McCartney, Billy Shears, in a number of interviews that he's done, he has said that in the beginning they weren't very good. But in any case, you were describing the reaction, which is something that I'm very used to, by the way. I was just...
I can imagine.
Yeah. But what Tavistock, and we'll get into Tavistock, what they're very, very good at doing is creating cults. And so when you look at the Beatles, they are a cult. They're a huge cult with a huge following. I would argue that it's a religion. It's another ism.
People react to it, Mike, as it is.
Yes.
I saw it. Like I said, I've had discussions, and the only time I've had a little bit of good discussions. I don't like to call them arguments because they never argue. Sometimes it gets a little heated, but it's a discussion.
Yeah.
And the only time I was really shocked because it's music to me, and I'm like, why are we arguing? I mean, this isn't my hill to die on. It's just what it is. And but people that are religious get that way. So you make a point.
It's a very emotional reaction. They become very triggered because you're cutting across their belief system. And you can't blame them because when you think about it, I think we spoke about this in the previous show, Rick, the Beatles story, the official narrative, has been hammered into people's heads for 60 years. Think about that. For 60 years. And so that's the story that people have come to know. That's what they're acclimated with. So when somebody like myself, or if you're asking questions and we're cutting across the grain, that gets very uncomfortable for many people, for the believers. And for those who are believers and Beatle fans, or maybe even a Beatle fanatic, let me just say again, like I said in the first show, I was a Beatle freak.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a very difficult pill for me to swallow as well as I was going down this path to understand what they were really about. And the interesting thing about the Beatles story is, well, especially the story that I'm looking into, what I refer to as the Cinderella story or the unofficial Beatles story, is the information that I'm bringing forth is in the public domain. It's out there. It's hidden in plain sight.
Like most things. Yep.
That's key to this. And so what we'll do is, where we left off last time, I believe, I was explaining how I was questioning the Beatles writing from scratch to record the Rubber Soul album.
Right.
16 songs. So it would be 14 songs for the album and 2 songs for a double A-side single, which was Day Tripper and We Can Work It Out. And I took the audience through how quickly those songs were being cranked out.
Yep.
It was like a conveyor belt process. And I said that that's not how songwriting works. There were a lot of issues, or there are a lot of issues with that story. Folks can go back to part 1 to take a listen. But there is another problem with the Rubber Soul sessions. So it's twofold. One is the 16 songs in 30 days. Write, learn, arrange, record, mix within a 30-day period of time. And I said that, well, that's really not reality. But here's the other piece of it. The Beatles wrapped up late in the evening, going into the early morning hours of November 12th of 1965.
Mm-hmm.
On the last day, November 11th, we're told that they finished up recording 4 songs, 2 of which did not exist before November 11th. So they had to write, learn, arrange, and record 2 of those songs. And one of them, Wait, was pulled in from the help sessions from earlier in the year, the basic rhythm tracks, but they still had to do overdubs and vocals on that. And there was another song that was, they started recording, at least the official narrative tells us this, earlier in November. So I think it was November 6th.
Okay.
So they finished that one up. So 2 brand new songs, one that they started and finished up during the Rubber Soul sessions, and another song, Wait, like I said, that they brought in from the help sessions. So that's the story, at least. But the bottom line is, we're told that they nailed down 4 songs on the last day. Quite a feat, if you ask me.
I agree.
And if you ask me, I don't believe that it's possible. But that's me, and the audience can decide for themselves. But the other problem that we have with the Rubber Soul sessions is not just the recording, the writing and recording. It has to do with the manufacturing process of the record. So we're told that after the Beatles finished up recording, again, November 11th going into the early morning hours of November 12th, George Martin and Norman Smith sit down and they start doing the final mixes. So my premise is the final mix, what that meant was to mix the Beatles' vocals, which is what they did for 30 days. They didn't write the songs, they didn't record the songs, they didn't play on the album. All of that was done beforehand. So the songs were all pre-written, The songs were all pre-recorded. So when the Beatles showed up on October 11th at EMI Studios, their job was to lay down the vocal tracks.
Okay.
And so when George Martin finished up the mixing, what he was doing was he was taking their finalized vocals and he was mixing it down to the pre-recorded instrumental tracks. And that's how the songs came together.
Okay.
Okay? So then we're told that George Martin finished up the sequencing of the songs on November 16th. So for those who are unfamiliar, sequencing means the order in which the songs are going to play on the record. So side 1 of the album, track 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Flip the album over, side B, track 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There were 14 songs on the album, 7 songs per side. So he finishes that up on November 16th. And then we're told the very next day, on November 17th of 1965, that the final mono lacquer was cut. What that means is now they are ready to create the stampers and start pressing the albums.
Okay.
So they either started pressing on November 17th or the very latest, November 18th, because they had to get Rubber Soul into the retail outlets by December 3rd. So when you calculate the time from November 17th to December 3rd, we're talking about 2.5 weeks. And we're talking about pressing thousands and thousands of albums. So here's the problem. How could you print the album covers with the songs on the back of the album cover if you only had the sequencing done the day before they've created the final mono lacquer?
Right.
How could that get done? Well, you can't print the record sleeves, and you cannot print the center labels of the 33 RPM record until the sequencing's done.
Right.
And that's a major, major problem with the Rubber Soul narrative. So we're expected to believe that George Martin finished up the sequencing on November 16th, and then, magically, everything got printed. Thousands and thousands of album covers and thousands of center labels for the 33 RPM record within 24 hours. Here's the other problem. The center labels for a 33 RPM record are pressed at the exact same time that the vinyl is being pressed. It's an automated process. So when the machine presses the vinyl, makes the record, the center label is pressed at the same time. The label for the record is not adhered to the vinyl later. It's adhered to the vinyl at the exact same time, the very time that they're pressing the record. So which means in order to start pressing the records, all of those center labels with the names of the songs in sequenced order, side A and side B, had to be in-house, on standby, and ready for the pressing process. Part of the team, when I was doing this work, has been in the music industry for a very long time, decades. Very familiar with the vinyl process, the manufacturing process. And I asked him, how many weeks for the whole process, how many weeks would that take to do what they had to do? And he said 8 weeks. 8 weeks to get everything done.
Wow.
So I said to him, well, let's just say that EMI pulled out all of the stops because it was the Beatles and it was a Beatle record that they were trying to get into the stores by December 3rd for the Christmas season. If EMI just threw everything they had at it, full capacity, how much time? 6 weeks. But the Beatles were able to, or EMI, George Martin was able to get finished up recording on November 11th / the 12th, sequencing done on the 16th of November, and the records in stores by December 3rd in 2.5 weeks. So it's a problem. I was also told by the person that was working with me on this that the printing process alone, called 4-color printing, it took a week for the ink to dry on the record sleeves, what they refer to as the slicks, before they could start handling them to create the actual album jackets, adhering them to the cardboard jackets and all that stuff. So it takes a week for the ink to dry, yet they got everything out the door starting on November 17th when the lacquer was cut, in stores on December 3rd in a little over 2 weeks. It doesn't work. It's a big problem. for the story. So the 16 songs is one piece of it, and then the manufacturing process, the printing process. And by the way, you know, when you do all this stuff, when you print, everything has to be proofed.
That's true.
You know, it's not like today where we have all of this digital ability and we can make changes on the fly. Any changes that had to be made, if there was an error in the printing, maybe they could have misspelled a word in a song title or whatever. That was a longer process than what would happen today in the digital age if something like that took place, you know?
Right.
So we're dealing with printing technology that goes back 6 decades. It's not today, so you can't think in terms of today's process. Okay, so that was just to finish up part 2 of what was the problem with Rubber Soul. So what happened was, once I took a look at this, I concluded that, okay, so what happened was the Beatles did not write the songs. They were not playing on the recorded tracks. The time frame in which they were operating in did not make it possible. It was not feasible. And so I concluded that between 1962 and 1966, that was the process that the Beatles were involved in. They did not write the songs. They weren't on the recorded tracks. They came in to sing the vocals. That was their job. Their job was to be a vocal group. But they were sold to us as this group of brilliant songwriters, genius songwriters, prolific songwriters,
Yep.
great musicians, but it's just a story. And again, I'm saying this, and I know that people are listening to this, Beatle fans, and this is, you're shaking your head. You're going, no, this guy's crazy. That's not how it worked, and so on. Okay? I know.
Yeah.
I know. Been there, done that. Okay? But I'm just saying, if you're really interested and you want to break through the programming, because that's what it is. It's brainwashing. Tavistock has conditioned the masses to believe this story. And like I said, to the point where it is a cult and it is a religion. And I was in the religion. I had a front row pew in the Church of the Fab Four.
And that's important. That's important, Mike, to let people know. Like you said that in the first interview, like the part 1, you were saying that you were a huge Beatle fan.
Yeah.
Like so this isn't like you were just picking on them from day one. This must have been, like when you were learning this, you were probably one of those people going, this is crazy.
The last thing I wanted to do was to pick on the Beatles. I loved them.
Yep.
And
I get it.
It was, I don't want to call it by chance or luck. I don't know. Maybe it's just some kind of synchronistic event that took place in my life when I bought the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, and I read that book, which was a difficult book for me to read because it contradicted the official narrative around the Beatles. It was 180 degrees diametrically opposed to what we have been told. So I had to get my head wrapped around it. So I could have done one of two things. I could have read the book and said, oh, this is just a bunch of nonsense, and just set it aside and go on believing the Beatles story, the official narrative, or do what I did, to dig in and say, well, is this book, is it true? Is it a bunch of nonsense? What's going on here? And so when I took the time to sit down and break the book down and decode it and go off and do the research, as I mentioned in the first show, I deducted that the book is truthful. And it does have threads of fiction in it. I mentioned this in the last show as well, because there needs to be plausible deniability.
Right.
Anybody who's interested can go to my channel. Rick gave you the name of the channel. I guess we could put the link down below too, and you can go poke around. I have 300 videos that I've done over 8 years on this topic. So, and I've covered just about every angle, to be honest with you. So
it's amazing.
So in any case, the one question that comes up is, well, why did they do this?
That's what I heard.
Why would the Beatles be a psychological operation? To understand this, we have to begin to dig into the control system and the ideology of the controlling matrix. We have to start to get our heads wrapped around that. Now, the overarching umbrella is Freemasonry. The world is run by secret societies, and the people who run things, run them, are occultists. And the word occult means hidden. So there's a hidden hand. And that hidden hand includes magic. And I'll explain this as we get into Aleister Crowley.
Perfect.
Now, this hidden hand under the umbrella of Freemasonry. And let me just explain something about Freemasonry as well. I won't go into great detail, but there is a book that I highly recommend that if you get a chance to read it, it's excellent.
Okay.
It's Freemasonry from A to Z.
All right.
And the author is John Coleman. So John Coleman is the same person that wrote The Committee of 300, and he has an excellent book on Tavistock. So it's Freemasonry from A to Z by John Coleman. Underneath the Freemasonic umbrella, there is a federation of many other secret societies. So we have the Jesuits, we have the Templars, we have the Pilgrim Society, many others that the Knights of Malta, the Rosicrucians.
Club of Rome would be in that group?
The Club of Rome is actually is an internationalist think tank institution.
Okay.
Versus a secret society. But here's the thing. People who belong to secret societies, the elites, they run the Club of Rome. As an example, Tavistock is not a secret society. Tavistock is an actual institution within the controlling matrix, the internationalist structure. The Club of Rome is the same thing. The Bilderbergs, Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, the United Nations, the World Bank, the Bank of International Settlements, the BIS, the International Monetary Fund. So anytime we see the word international or united, it's a pretty good bet that what we have there is an organization tucked in within the controlling matrix, the deep state.
That's a great term, too. I don't mean to cut you off, but I just want to say, like, all my listeners should be really on par with what you're saying and really listening, because this is what I cover on my show. I mean, I don't know how to, if people aren't listening and resonating with what you're saying, then they're not listening, because that's basically what every show I get into in one form or another. We're speaking about what you're speaking about, these shadow governments and how we are being controlled. The social engineers are in every aspect of our lives, and nothing, I always say nothing is left to chance. They have it all covered, and it goes that deep. So I'm hoping people are realizing, like, this is what I talk about, so it makes sense to me.
When I talk about the secret societies, it's also important to understand that these people, they're not just members of one secret society.
Right.
So they could be a Freemason and a Jesuit. They could be a Jesuit and a Rosicrucian. They could be a Freemason and a Templar. They could be a Freemason and belong to the Pilgrim Society. Now, the Pilgrim Society is a very powerful secret society that very few people know about.
I haven't heard that one.
There's a great YouTube channel, American Intelligence Media. They don't do a lot of videos, but when they do, it's pretty good stuff.
Okay.
So the Pilgrim Society is made up of the Eastern liberal elites. So this would be the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Fords, the Morgans, all of the names that we're familiar with. Think in terms of the American Industrial Revolution from that time period.
Okay.
Very powerful families. And they're tied into the British elitist system. So the Pilgrim Society is comprised of American elites and British elites. And the control system goes up through Britain, back up through the inner city of London, referred to as the Crown Corporation. Most people know the Rothschilds, know the name at least, a very, very important piece of this puzzle. And then you have other secret societies like the Black Nobility, and the Black Nobility draw their lineage back to Rome, back to the Roman Church. And they are very, very powerful. There are other researchers, to take it a step further, will say that the British monarchy traces its ancestry back to the House of David, a Davidic bloodline, which takes us back to where? It takes us back to Israel.
Yep. This is stuff people need to hear and how deep it goes. I think that's the problem, is a lot of people, at least I speak with, they have a really hard time knowing how deep it runs. And it's like, this is really deep and it's very hidden, but it's hidden in plain sight. I love when you said that, because that's what I say. Like, it's out there. And to me, they're getting to the point now where they're just blatantly not even trying to hide themselves now, because they just do whatever they want, and people just say, oh, whatever. But That's what I'm trying to tell people what we're up against. We're up against social engineers that are master psychologists that know it, how we think better than we ever could. And they have studied us and they are steering us.
It's not easy to march through this because it's very complicated.
It is.
And if you ask 10 researchers to explain the hierarchy of the control system, you might very well get 10 different answers.
Very true.
They'll explain the same players, but who exactly is where on the ladder in the pecking order, that in all likelihood would differ. But what I explain to people is it's more important at this point in time to understand that there is a control system and you're being controlled. That's the most important thing right now.
Agreed.
After you figure that out, then you can do the research to figure out, okay, well, who are these people? Who are these organizations? Who are these secret societies? When did they enter into the game? Like I said, it's complicated. So to talk about the black nobility as an example, I think it was John Coleman mentions that some of the black nobility actually sit on the Committee of 300. So we're talking about very powerful families. The British monarchy goes back to, at least Robert Sepper said that the British royal family goes back to the House of David. And there was another researcher recently that said the exact same thing. So anyway, that would explain some of, in fact, it probably would explain a lot about what's going on right now with Israel.
Oh, for sure, you're right, and I'm glad you brought up Tavistock too in the Committee of 300 because I was saying maybe I've said a lot of my show, Mike, and I know maybe in the first show that we did that I think everybody's heard that name Tavistock in the Committee of 300, but I had somebody once email me that told me about it, and they're like, yeah, but you got to go deeper. Don't just look at the surface of that. You have to start digging in to what Tavistock is and how deep it goes. And when that's what I've been doing. That's lately what I've been doing. And my mind's blown. I'm like, wow. Like people have to look into what Mike is saying. Tavistock, Committee of 300. When you figure that out, you're going to see the world and you're going to go, I get it, what they're doing.
Right. So in the last show, I mentioned there's two books, Daniel Estulin's book on Tavistock and Dr. John Coleman's book on Tavistock. Now, Daniel's book was, I think he published it in 2008, and Dr. Coleman published his back, I think, in 2005. So what we have to keep in mind is they're giving us all of this information about Tavistock, and that was 20 years ago. And like Rick said, when you start digging into Tavistock and you read those two books to start, it will blow your mind. And what will blow your mind even more is when you take a step back, you pause and you think, wow, and that was 20 years ago. So what has happened 20 years since? Because we're sitting in 2024 now. This all goes back to the Egyptian mysteries and back to the Babylonian mysteries, back to the priesthood. So those are the two primary threads, back to Egypt, back to Babylon. So this will give you an idea of how long this has been around. So let me just read this here. This is, I got this off of Henry Mackow's website, some interesting information on the black nobility. It says the most powerful of the black nobility families are located in Italy, Germany. Germany is important because where were the Beatles? The Beatles were in Hamburg, Germany. Where is the Frankfurt School? In Germany. Switzerland, Britain, Holland, and Greece in that order. Their roots may be traced back to the Venetian oligarchs. This is what I was mentioning before. Back to Italy, back to Rome, who are of Khazar extraction. Now, the Khazars, the Khazarian Empire, has to do with the Jewish control system, and they married into these royal houses in the early part of the 12th century. According to researcher and author John Coleman, a Committee of 300 was established early in the 18th century, although it did not take on its present form until around 1897, when the China opium trade was legalized. It goes back to what I was saying before. There's a lot of players. It's very intricate. So then it goes on to say that documented proof as to the existence of the Committee of 300 is not forthcoming, and it may be no more than a convenient phrase to describe certain key players. But then take a listen to this. Socialist politician and financial advisor to the Rothschilds, Walter Rathenau, writing in the Weiner Press on December 24th of 1921, so Christmas Eve of 1921, said, "Only 300 men, each of whom knows all others, govern the fate of Europe. They select their successors from their own entourage. These men have the means in their hands of putting an end to the form of state which they find unreasonable." Exactly 6 months after publication, Rathenau was assassinated. So the socialist politician and financial advisor to the Rothschilds spilled the beans about the secretive group of 300, and then 6 months later, he was dead. He was assassinated. So this stuff is real, and like Rick said, we have to dig in. Let's go back to why the Beatles are mixed up into this. The ideology of the controlling system, of the controllers, is communism. And if we go back to World War I, we had the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Lots of blood was spilled in the Great War, World War I. And the Bolsheviks won that war. Bolshevism is communism, and I have said that the Bolsheviks, the communists, made its way into Zionism. That's what I've concluded because it's pattern recognition, Rick.
Exactly.
You're seeing the same players constantly paging in and out and involved in what's going on in the world. Decisions, major decisions that are made across the world. Now, what happened was, after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Marxists, the communists, were expecting that the world was going to unite under communism. Remember the old slogan, "World Workers Unite"?
Yes.
Well, it didn't happen. So this was a setback for them because they were expecting momentum where there was going to be a worldwide communist movement, Marxist movement. So think of Karl Marx as a theoretician. Then you had Lenin, and Lenin's ways of implementing Marxism was through violence, through force. But there was another group of Marxists that said, you're going about this the wrong way. You're not going to get where we need to go if you're going to run around blatantly creating war, killing people, and spilling blood. That's not going to work. So enter a group of Marxists known as the Frankfurt School. So the Frankfurt School is really an adjunct to the University of Frankfurt. So it's not actually a school. It's a group of intellectuals, Jewish intellectuals, that formulated a way in which to get Marxism implemented worldwide without the violence. That's known as cultural Marxism. So cultural Marxism, what it looks to do, it looks to subvert from within. So they infiltrate the institutions of a country, the government, the politics, and they start to break it down from within. When you go and you read about the Frankfurt School, and the four primary members were Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, who John Coleman ties into the Beatles, and I believe Dr. Coleman is correct, Herbert Marcuse, and Erich Fromm. So let me just, I'll go through the Frankfurt School in a moment here, but I just want to read a quote from Max Horkheimer from the Frankfurt School. He said, "The revolution won't happen with guns. Rather, it will happen incrementally, year by year, generation by generation. We will gradually infiltrate their educational institutions and their political offices, transforming them slowly into Marxist entities as we move towards universal egalitarianism." So when you read about cultural Marxism and the Frankfurt School, you're going to see the word egalitarian a lot. Think of it in terms of equal outcomes versus equal opportunity.
Right.
They're thinking in terms of some utopia where there is no class structure, everything is taken care of. I'm hoping most people understand at least the basic tenets of what Marxism is about.
I would hope so. And I hope they realize that what you're speaking about right now, Mike, is key. And if you're looking at what's been going on in our world, you have to, I hope they can see that this is what's exactly going on. They're infiltrating everything, like you said, from the inside and basically rotting it from the inside out.
One of the institutions, the industries that they infiltrated, obviously, would be Hollywood entertainment
Mm-hmm.
and the music industry. Okay? But we'll just put that on pause for now. So when you read about the Frankfurt School and you read about their writings, it reads like it's altruistic, it reads like it's egalitarian, but my question is it really that, or are they gaslighting us? Are they telling people what they want to hear and then go about their business behind the scenes, completely contradicting the message that they're giving to the population worldwide? Bertrand Russell, who was connected into the Frankfurt School, and I believe Bertrand Russell was also connected into the Fabian Society. Now, the Fabian Society is another organization very similar to the Frankfurt School, but they were out of England, and they were huge into eugenics. And the symbol for the Fabian Society is a wolf in sheep's clothing. They're going to make change, but it's going to be methodical and incremental. So Bertrand Russell said that the goal was to produce an unshakable conviction that snow is black. So to brainwash people and condition them to accept irrational, illogical situations, conditions, environments, thinking. So cultural Marxism looks to subvert from within. The other thing is, when we look at the Frankfurt School and we take a look at this ideology, there are synergies between the protocols of Zion and Frankfurt's critical theory ideology. So that's what the Frankfurt School was known for. Their cultural Marxism was done through a theory called critical theory. Critical theory, what it does is it divides the masses into two categories: oppressors and victims. So think about that. What do we have today? Oppressors and victims. And we've had that for a long time. We're constantly bombarded with that ideology. The intent was to destabilize society and destroy the oppressive order. So in their minds, traditional values, the traditional ways of life as it existed prior to, let's say, World War II and right after World War II, that had to go. Institutionalized religion, especially Christianity. So what critical theory does is it dissects existing social beliefs and criticizes them in a way to redefine existing beliefs, as well as values and morals, which they say were imposed by governments, religions, etc. So these government organizations and these religions are oppressive, and therefore they are inhibiting human potential. Now, I'm assuming that if you're into the truth and you've been into alternative research and you're taking a look at what's going on in the world today, you can see how this is out there today, this type of ideology. So the Frankfurt School recommended the creation of racial divides, other types of racial conflicts that have been manufactured, continual change to create confusion. That's another one of their tactics. Teaching sex and alternative sexual lifestyles to children, undermining the authority of schools and teachers, promoting excessive drinking and drugs, emptying churches. I mentioned before about the war on Christianity. Now, in John Coleman's book, he tells us that Freemasons despise Christianity. Contrary to what they say publicly, their doctrine has no room and no patience for Christianity. Also in John Coleman's book, he explains that, I believe it's the 26th degree in the 33 degrees of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, when he's told that Lucifer is their god. Prior to that, to enter into Freemasonry, all you need is a belief in a god. It doesn't matter who that god is. But by the 26th degree, according to John Coleman, it's spelled out. Lucifer is their god. Where they're going with this is a pagan-based spiritual ideology and lifestyle. And I'll talk about the cult of Pan, because the cult of Pan is tied into Luciferianism. It's tied into this paganism. And I'm going to read something from a book, a very good book, Aleister Crowley and the Cult of Pan, where it describes the attributes of Pan. And we're going to be able to lay that up against what's going on in the world today and what has been going on in the world in the past. And hopefully we'll be able to connect some dots. One of their other ways of doing things, or one of their ways of disrupting society, is to create an unreliable legal system, dependency on the state, and controlling the media to dumb down the masses and to encourage the breakdown of the family. And we'll get into the breakdown of the family in a moment, because they are anti the husband, the strong male. And the way they couch that is the world would just be a better place, a softer place, a more gentler place if it was matriarchal versus patriarchal. A lot of people believe this, but the reason why you believe this is because you've been brainwashed and indoctrinated to believe this. Men create wars. No, the elites create wars. They create all of this havoc. They create all of this chaos. They create all of this dysfunction. And then they blame the average Joe in the street. It's like the Club of Rome. The Club of Rome is responsible for all of the wacky ecological nonsense that permeates the consciousness today. As an example, climate change, global warming, global cooling, that all comes out of the Club of Rome. And who do they blame for that? They blame you and me for that. They blame you and I for the climate supposedly changing. But they never talk about the geoengineering that they have been engaged in for the past 30 years. They'll never talk about that. They never talk about the fact that they have the ability to steer the weather, to control the weather. Don't believe me? Go to MIT's website and type in geoengineering. Stratospheric aerosol spraying is another term. So the point I'm making is they create all this stuff. They create the chaos, problem, reaction, solution, and then they push it down to the people so that the people will fight between themselves. And while people are fighting and throwing rocks at each other and screaming and yelling, left, right, liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican, Biden, Trump, they're off pushing the ball forward, closer and closer to the goal line. The Frankfurt School promoted pansexualism. This is the cult of Pan. And what that means, it's the search for pleasure and overthrowing traditional relationships. It's hedonism. And I'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the Beat movement, which was the precursor to the Beatles. As I mentioned, they want to marginalize the role of the father. They want to abolish the male, quote, dominance. For example, women are oppressed because of men. They want to remove the parents as the primary educators, and they want to obfuscate the difference between genders. The whole women's movement was manufactured coming out of the Frankfurt School and Tavistock. When you go back in time, the traditional role of the woman was accepted by most women, that they were the caretakers of the home, to be the mother at home with the children, to raise them, while the male or the father, the husband, had the role of provider, protector, and security. Now, this is not something that's wacky. This was the traditional role of the man and the woman. And again, I've noticed people listening to this right now and saying, no, no, women's rights and all this. Women's rights and all that stuff, Gloria Steinem and all that, were all put out there to brainwash the population, shifting away from a traditional role, from traditional values, and to turn things upside down. The traditional family relationships and the roles of the mother and the father, the man and the woman, put us in a whole lot better place than where we are today, because right now we're seeing the results of all of this brainwashing and all of this conditioning that has been jackhammered into people's heads. Many people believe this is the way it works. Well, it only works this way because it has been subverted from within, and then it has been pushed through the pipe by politicians and governments and laws and regulations and acts and mandates that were put out there to force behavioral modification.
And we're seeing that now, Mike. Like, I hope people, and I'm really happy to say, Mike, that I'm watching chat as you're speaking, and the people in the chat get it. Like they're like they're like he's on it, like he's on target, and I'm glad to see that, because you guys in the chat are awesome, and I hope people that aren't in the chat and that are listening realize, like, take a look at what they're doing. And I talk about it constantly, so people know that on my show I'm always talking about how they're destroying the family unit. And they have to weaken the family, and that's what they're doing. And what you're talking about, that's not nature, that's not natural. That's social engineering, and that is mind control. That is nothing natural about what is happening.
There's a natural order.
Exactly.
Everything they do is artificial. It's forced.
Correct.
And the only way they can get away with what they get away with is if people fall in line and play their game. So the Frankfurt School also said that music can be used to promote mental illness and destroy society. And verses set to music, in other words, lyrics, and repeatedly intoned are very effective. So here we're getting into how music is going to be used to turn things upside down, to subvert from within, so that they can move their Marxist agenda forward. Theodore Adorno was quoted as saying that they could promote a culture of pessimism and despair via radio and television.
Absolutely.
For those who are listening, think about when you turn, hopefully you're not doing this too often, but let's just say, you happen to be going through the channels and you're watching cable news. Is there anything ever good that comes out of the television set? Is there ever a good story, feel-good story, something positive? No. It's always about tragedy. It's always about war. It's always something that is going to try to inflict fear and concern and worry and stress and anxiety in your life. That's the use of the media to ruin your life, to make you focus on things that if they weren't doing what they're doing with their social engineering, many of these issues would not be in your life. You'd be in a happier place, a more productive place. Frankfurt's network extends into eugenics, like the Fabians, as I mentioned earlier, population control, sexual and family law reforms. It is linked to publishing houses, medical, educational, and research establishments, women's organizations, marriage counseling, and governments, and on and on and on. Now, the Frankfurt School, the Fabian Society, and all of these other think tanks and these organizations and secret societies, they're all working together. So the Fabian Society and the Frankfurt School, they converge into Tavistock. So they're not separate.
Mm-hmm.
They actually, they page, it's like a revolving door, It's like our government.
Yeah.
When you take a look at the private sector and then the government sector. Think in terms of when a president appoints somebody to their cabinet or to the treasury and they worked for Goldman Sachs. And then once that 4-year term is up, what happens to that person that worked for Goldman Sachs? Well, they go back to Goldman Sachs or some other financial institution. The 3 major financial entities that essentially control all of the financials in the world would be BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. So we have this, like I said, this revolving door thing going. Now, let me just talk about the cult of Pan. And then I'm trying to get myself organized here. I am trying to keep myself organized with.
You're doing incredible.
Well, thank you.
Incredible. There's a lot. It's a
here.
lot. It's a lot. That's why I try to tell people, like, it's so hard to cover it because it's such a big web. So when you try, to try to weave through it in a couple hours, it's not easy because it's so much going on. So I'm glad that you're doing a great job breaking this down.
And it's esoteric.
Absolutely. Yep.
That's the piece of it that is very difficult to get your arms around. There's this esoteric, mystical piece of it that is a big part of what's going on. So let me get into that quickly, and hopefully this will make the point. So in the last show, I told Rick and the audience about a book. It's Aleister Crowley and the Cult of Pan. So what is the Cult of Pan? So in the book, I think it's on page 36, it's the best definition of the Cult of Pan I have ever found. So Pan is the goat foot god of, quote, panic, or pandemonium, or pandemic. Okay. It is the sudden fear that seizes one who is alone in the forest. He is the god of vegetation, vegetarianism. There's nothing wrong with being a vegetarian, but we're going to start to see how there are linkages to the programming and the messaging and the social aspects of life today, how it gets pulled back into these ancient mythologies. Pan's name has been translated as meaning all, for he stands for the manifestation of nature. Now, nature goes back to paganism, I mentioned before that where the controllers are going is a pagan-based ideology. It's a pagan-based spiritual belief system. Luciferianism, panism, the cult of Dionysus. This is all the same. He is raw, undirected energy, the dance of blood along the arteries, the rising sap. He is sexual desire running amok, the god of unfettered bodily instinct. No social force contains him. He is the lord of death, of corruption, bodily decay, and dissolution. He is also the mindless mob instinct, the beast who takes control of man, the frenzy of the orgy. Wine, women, and song quicken his pleasure. He plays his pipe, and the forest resounds with laughter and celebration. Think of the Led Zeppelin song Stairway to Heaven, talking about laughter. In the esoteric tradition of the West, he often borrows the attributes of Dionysus. I mentioned the cult of Dionysus, who is the lord of wine, who provides over intoxication and its after effects. That's the cult of Pan. And a person that was in the cult of Pan and extremely influential and who plays a big part in all of this is Aleister Crowley. But let me just cover Tavistock real quick, and then we'll get into Crowley. Tavistock is an internationalist organization responsible for implementing change via brainwashing, social engineering. They collaborate with other internationalist think tanks and theoreticians. As an example, I mentioned the Fabians in Frankfurt, and there are many others. It reports up through the Committee of 300, and you can get all the information on that from John Coleman's book on the Committee of 300. They have far-reaching influence throughout governments, NGOs, which are non-government organizations, the private business sector, corporations, public and private institutions, mass media, global think tanks, the military, education, and the music and entertainment industry. Tavistock's tentacles are very wide and very deep. Occultism is integrated within Tavistock's psychological approaches to manipulate and transform thinking. And I mentioned that the ideology and the objectives of the controllers is to implement Marxism via cultural Marxism, and that is subverting from within. A one-world government, centralized control, Luciferian pagan-based, and Crowleyism. And that goes back to Crowley's religion of Thelema and his Book of the Law. The tenets are to pursue one's true or pure will. There's going to be a new eon, a new age, the Eon of Horus. And I'll get into Crowley, we'll talk about the Eon of Horus, and you'll see how that maps exactly to what we're talking about with the Frankfurt School and Tavistock. So the obstacles to a one-world system obviously would be traditional values. So if it's family-centric, that's a problem.
Exactly, yep.
Traditional institutionalized religion, like I said, Christianity. Freemasons despise Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
They won't admit it, but according to John Coleman in his book, Freemasonry, A to Z, that's where it's at. They claim that, or they believe that, a rules or a law-based society inhibits the pursuit of will and freedom, and that goes back to Crowley's Eon of Osiris. And again, don't worry about this if this is not connecting yet. I'll get into Crowley. So methods of brainwashing would be social engineering, reshaping and redefining values, morals, beliefs, and ethics, creating a new culture. What is that new culture that they've created? What is cultural Marxism? How can we think of it in terms of something that we know? Pop culture. Cultural Marxism is pop culture.
Very interesting.
They want to break down traditional structures, as I mentioned. The common thread with the Frankfurt School, with Tavistock, is a thread of psychology, behavior modification, and hedonism, the cult of Pan. And they're going about their process of changing the world to move toward their one-world governance and their one-world religion via an alchemical process. And that process entails dismantling the old and bringing in the new. It's the phoenix rising from the ashes. The phoenix is Lucifer. Okay, so let's take a moment and let me just mention the beat movement quickly, because and then we'll get into Crowley.
Perfect. I want to hear about, the beat. This is something I want to hear about too.
Yeah, let me just get to it real quick here.
Because this is like so many of the things, Mike, as you're looking for that I talk about on this show, like the destruction of the family and what they're doing, and then when you learn about the music in Hollywood, you really then you really start to see it. But you see it in every any rock you turn, there it is. Like they're really, I've always said they've really done their job well. As an adversary, you have to respect them because they're on the same page getting it done, and we're all over the place fighting with each other, like you said.
Yes.
That's the problem.
Yes. I mentioned in the first show, Rick, that the one thing that the controllers do, and they do really well, is to set aside their differences.
They do.
They have their eye on the big picture, the
Yep.
goal line. And are there disagreements within the pyramid of power? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
They don't all agree on methods and tactics and whatever. But they're able to sit down at the table and say, you know what? Okay, I understand you don't agree, or we're not completely square on this, but don't worry about it. Let's get to where we need to be. Let's get to the goal line, into the end zone, and once we're there, then we'll
deal with it.
we'll deal with our differences.
Yep.
Whereas humanity does the exact opposite. They will sit there and spin their wheels, running on a treadmill, throwing rocks at each other, and with no goal line. And even worse, they're waiting for some savior to come save the day, to pull them out of the ditch. And I'm not just talking about a religious person. I'm talking about politicians. Some politician's going to get elected and everything's going to be okay. So let's just talk about the Beat Generation for a moment. So the Beat Generation was the precursor leading into the Beatles. And when we take a look at the name of the band, the Beatles, it's representative of the Egyptian scarab beetle, which is associated with enlightenment. So remember I said that Freemasonry and these secret societies go back to the Egyptian mysteries, the Egyptian mythology, back to the Babylonian mysteries and priesthood. Well, the Egyptian scarab beetle is associated with enlightenment. And there are many images of the Beatles engaged in occult symbolism if you take a look on the internet. One-eyed symbolism, Masonic handshakes, and on and on and on. Beatles, B-E-A-T-L-E-S, has ties back to the Beat movement. So Beatles and the Beat movement, B-E-A-T. Three key players in the Beat movement were William S. Burroughs, who was on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Allen Ginsberg, and Jack Kerouac. And John Lennon was a big fan of Jack Kerouac, and Billy, who plays the role of Paul McCartney, has collaborated with Allen Ginsberg. So, what do we see with this interaction? Well, we're seeing that members of the Beatles are associated with people who are cultural Marxists, because the Beat Generation were cultural Marxists. The members of the Beat Generation developed a reputation as new bohemian hedonists who celebrated nonconformity and spontaneous creativity. This would be the cult of Pan. In other words, nothing can hold you back. And this ties into Aleister Crowley. Pursue your true or pure will. And I'll read Crowley's book 77 in a moment. It's not that long. And we'll get a very good idea of where Crowley was going with true and pure will. Elements of the expanding Beat movement from the late 40s into the 50s was incorporated into the hippie and larger counterculture movements. So the counterculture movement was directly linked into cultural Marxism, into a Marxist ideology. The Beats had a pervasive influence on rock and roll and popular music, including the Beatles, Bob Dylan, and Jim Morrison. The Beatles spelled their name as a reference or in reverence to the Beat Generation. And as I mentioned, John Lennon was a fan of Jack Kerouac. And the Beatles put Beat writer William S. Burroughs on the cover of their Sgt. Pepper album cover. That's the Beat Generation. So where are we right now? So what I'm trying to do is to help the audience understand that there is a culture war. And we've heard that term before, the culture wars. But a lot of people didn't know, what does that mean? What exactly does that mean? What war? What cultures are you talking about? Most people never even ask the question. It's the culture that existed prior to these Marxists getting their hands into our business.
Right. You're correct. Yep.
The traditional values, the family values, traditional religious beliefs, the way people conducted themselves followed more of the natural order. That's not to say everything did, but a lot of it did. People were more instinctual about what had to get done. People were a lot more resilient. They were a lot more resourceful.
Yep. God, so true.
Think about all of the small businesses that used to exist, all of the entrepreneurs that used to exist, the sole proprietors. Think of that. Think of all the stores that used to be owned by small businesses going back 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago. What they did as part of this cultural Marxism was to create this corporatocracy, this corporate matrix.
Hmm.
Remember what I said about the Fabian Society? A wolf in sheep's clothing with a turtle being their symbol, saying a very slow, methodical march. That's how we're going to get things done, which is also the exact same thing that Max Horkheimer said that I read earlier from the Frankfurt School. So what they did was they created a corporate construct where they moved a disproportionate number of people from an employment perspective into the corporate structure. So small businesses started to diminish, sole proprietors, and so on.
You're so right with the small businesses too, Mike, because even in my town, especially with COVID, there's none left. Like that was like the final, at least where I live. I can only speak for what I can see and who I've spoken with, but a lot of people I speak with, that businesses that have been generational, like you just said, for 50, 60 years are gone. Like they're boarded up, they're done. They couldn't.
It's gone.
Yeah, it's all big stores now, and it's so sad to see. But you see that they're doing their job well.
This is the Frankfurt School. This is Tavistock. This is their social engineering through their social scientists that have created this. Now, Crowley, let's talk about Crowley real quick.
Yeah, this is crazy. Oh, my God.
It is crazy. I know it's crazy. I'm going to move quickly here because we're really low on time. The Aeon of Horus is a concept of Crowley's that is based on the Book of the Law, which he allegedly channeled while in Egypt back early in the 20th century. He published the Book of the Law in 1909,
right,
which, by the way, the Beatles song, One After 909, is Crowley's Law of Reversal. So he published the Book of the Law in 1909, and if we reverse 1909, we get 9091. It's the one after 909. So that's a very simple tie of the Beatles back to Crowley, aside from the fact that he's on the Sgt. Pepper album cover, but there's a lot more than those two examples. He was prominent within the cultic elite. He was with British intelligence. I mentioned a book from the first show. Great book. I recommend reading it. Secret Agent 666 by Richard Spence. In memoirs, they refer to Crowley as the father of modern Satanism. His religion of Thelema is the prevailing religious doctrine of the Pyramid of Power. And the Pyramid of Power is a term that I coined to explain the corporate structure of how the elites work. It's a corporate structure. It's like a big multinational corporation. So when we take a look at Freemasonry, think in terms of like Freemasonry Incorporated. Crowley believed an initiate must experience the dark side of duality in order to become enlightened and achieve illumination. Rituals included sex magic, non-heterosexual sex magic, drugs, summoning entities, etc. Enlightenment and illumination is achieved by moving degree by degree through rituals. So Crowley had taken over the OTO, and in order to achieve the upper levels of degrees within the OTO, required sex magic. Members of the OTO at the time, there were those that did not subscribe to that and didn't want to go there, but because at a certain point he let it, he mandated that if you want to get from here to there, sex magic. Crowley's teachings and the process of becoming an adept is reserved for the upper echelon of secret societies. And again, folks, this is based upon my research. Some people want to argue. That's fine. You can argue with me if you want, but this is where I landed with this stuff. Lower level initiates are used as tools to promote the Thelemic satanic ideology. That would be celebrities, entertainers, politicians, etc. The Aeon of Horus will be comprised of literalists who subscribe to the tenets of Thelema. This will require extensive depopulation to remove nonconformists, so the new age starts with a devout base. Non-adherents will be relegated to slaves. And this is in Crowley's book 77. It's only one page, so if I don't get to it, just go on the internet, type in Aleister Crowley book 77. You can read it for yourself. The controllers are playing out Crowley's blueprint for the new age, the age of Horus, the Aeon of Horus, by applying an alchemical process. So basically the alchemical process means that they are breaking down the old structures. They're tearing it down so that they can bring in their structure.
Correct.
Let me just explain for a second here, because this will tie back to the Frankfurt School, it'll tie back to Tavistock, it'll tie back to the cult of Pan. Crowley taught that the eon of Osiris, which is equivalent to the Piscean age, was an age of oppression. It was rules-based, it shackled humanity, man and woman, did not optimize their lives because they were unable to pursue their true and pure will.
Mm-hmm.
But with the eon of Horus, the new eon, which he claimed started in the early 1900s, about the time that he released or published the Book of the Law in 1909, that was the beginnings of it. The eon of Horus would be completely different. The eon of Horus was going to be a period, an age of enlightenment, of illumination, where man and women did pursue their true and pure will, and it would lead to this utopia. This is the same premise that the cultural Marxists were presenting. There are oppressors and victims. We have to get rid of this age of oppression so that we can bring in this new age, this new control system of egalitarianism and altruism. It's the same thing. I'll read the 5 basic bullets from Crowley's.
Oh, that'd be great. Thank you.
Man has the right to live by his own law, to live in the way that he wills to do, to work as he will, to play as he will, to rest as he will, to die when and how as he will. Man has the right to eat what he will, to drink what he will, to dwell where he will, to move as he will on the face of the earth. Man has the right to think what he will, to speak what he will, to write what he will, to draw, paint, carve, etch, mold, build as he will, to dress as he will. Man has the right to live as he will. Take your fill and will of love as ye will, going back to the cult of Pan, and to do this when, where, and with whom ye will. Man has the right to kill those who would thwart these rights. The slaves shall serve. Love is the law, love under will. Now, there are Thelemites and Crowley proponents that will say, no, he's talking about everybody. Everybody's going to benefit from this. And I'm like, no, everybody's not going to benefit from this because Crowley was part of the elite system. He was part of the elite establishment. And his religion of Thelema, with all of its rituals, this is reserved for adepts and initiates who are within the elite controlling system.
Mm-hmm.
And if it was for everybody, why would he say the slaves shall serve? So in other words, if you're not rowing the boat and you're an outlier and you're not buying into this, then you're not going to be in this club.
That's the key point. You're right.
We have to understand that the controllers don't care about us, Rick. I know you know this. They don't care about us. They call us useless eaters. They're trying to clearly depopulate the world. They talk about this all the time.
Yeah, they don't even try to hide it anymore.
We have Yuval Harari telling the world that they have reached godlike status. He also said that Jesus is fake news. So for those of you who are Christian out there, listen to what Yuval Harari is saying. He's with the World Economic Forum. Remember, I talked about these organizations within the internationalist structure. Well, the WEF is one of these main players, especially today. Listen to what they're saying. They have achieved godlike status. Jesus is fake news. He even talks about what are they going to do with all of the people that don't have a lot of skills. Well, what are we going to do with them? I think he said something like we'll give them video games and we'll drug them up. Something to that effect. I'm paraphrasing, but that was pretty much what he said. So the Beatles are part of this agenda to disrupt. It was an agenda to social engineer the world on a grand scale. It was to break down traditional values. It was to be anti-establishment. It was to bring in a counterculture. It was to introduce a drug culture, to introduce free love, which goes back to the cult of Pan, especially when we got to the Beatles' psychedelic era with Sgt. Pepper. Now, the first 7 albums, or 8 albums, because the 8th album was the Greatest Hits album, a collection of oldies. So the first 7 albums would be Please Please Me Through Revolver. We could see how it all kind of started and how it was progressing through the timeline. It started very basic with their first album, Please Please Me, just basic rock and roll numbers. The Beatles were dressing differently. They had these different haircuts. Their attitudes were a little snarky, pushing back on the establishment, press, anybody who was interviewing them. There was kind of this this banter that went back and forth, and that was done intentionally to make the person who was asking the question, they were perceived as part of the establishment, to look like they were dull, like they weren't hip.
Yep.
To use terms going back to the 1960s, they were squares. These are inhibited people. These are people that are constrained. These are people that are not optimizing their life. And so we're going to push back at them.
Yep, you're making great points. I just want to add really quickly, Mike, that it's really noticeable when you go back and look at old footage before the time we're speaking about, and you see how different even the music was, and they were on stage. They were very stiff, and they were kind of standing there just doing their thing, but it was a totally different look. And then what you're speaking about, you start to see this change very quickly of like just. It just seems like the wheels come off, and you have like the Doors, and you got the Beatles, and you got the Rolling Stones, and you're like, whoa, what a change, but engineered.
It's engineered. Tavistock engineers and creates the genres of music.
It's so noticeable. It really is when you look.
The British invasion, remember I said earlier that it all goes back up through Britain, back up through the Crown, the Crown Corporation.
Yep.
The British invasion, folks. The Tavistock invasion, if you want to get even more basic.
I agree.
So let's just talk about the Beatles real quick in Germany. Why Germany? Because a lot of people believe, well, that's where the Beatles were, that's where they were learning to write their songs and become great musicians and all that stuff. Wrong. The Beatles weren't writing any music in Hamburg. I have a Pete Best interview where he said, that goes back years ago, where he said that they were playing 7 hours a night. They had to be at the venue by 6 o'clock. And by the time they got done playing, they went back to where they were staying. In the very early days, it was an old rundown cinema. They got up at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Pete Best said this, not Mike Williams, Pete Best. So they get up at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and they have to be back at the venue at 6 o'clock. How much songwriting do you think they were doing between 3 and 6?
Exactly.
0. Let's talk about Germany. Why was Germany important? The powerful black nobility families, which I mentioned earlier, are located in Italy, Germany, Switzerland, Britain, Holland, and Greece. In that order. That's the order of importance, how powerful those families are. So Germany is number 2 on the list, right behind Italy. Mayer Rothschild, who was the Rothschild that got this whole thing kicked off with the banking system, the international bankers, he's from Frankfurt, Germany. Wilhelm Wundt, 1832 through 1920, was a German psychologist, philosopher, and professor, and is considered one of the fathers of modern psychology, and more specifically, experimental psychology. He was the father of what they considered modern psychology, and everything after that was built upon Wilhelm Wundt. The OTO, or the Ordo Templi Orientis, Crowley, is an occult secret society, and it was founded at the beginning of the 20th century. It originated in Germany or Austria between 1895 and 1906. I find it interesting that in Wikipedia they really can't nail down exactly where and a year, but Germany or Austria. Hamburg is a major media center in Germany. A lot of people don't know this, and a colleague of mine, Patrick O'Carroll, sent me an email letting me know this. Frankfurt University is a 6-hour drive to Hamburg.
Wow, okay.
When the Beatles arrived in Hamburg in August of 1960, as I just mentioned, they played 7 hours a night, and it was a very decadent environment. The red light district, lots of booze. It was very, very decadent. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, just to throw this in, many Beatle fans will know the name Astrid Kircher. Astrid was a German photographer, and her photography was known for her association with the Beatles while they were in Hamburg. And the way the story goes is that in 1960, when the Beatles were there, when they were not writing songs and they weren't a very good band, Astrid Kircher plugs into them. And now she's taking pictures of a band that is not notable, Rick. Mm-hmm. They're not on anybody's radar, but she's taking all of these very artistic pictures. To the audience, test this out for yourself. Watch a lot of these rock documentaries that you'll find on Amazon. Many times what you'll see is before these artists, like Tom Petty is a good example, mm-hmm. There's all of this film footage going back, way back when, of the band and so on. The other one was Gordon Lightfoot. Watch the Gordon Lightfoot documentary.
I was just going to bring that up when you were done. I was going to be like, there's some weird stuff in that documentary.
The filming, Rick. There's all of this artistic film angles
Yep.
taken from when he was supposedly a nobody.
Exactly.
Nobody even knew he existed, right? The only person that knew he existed was maybe his girlfriend and his guitar. What's happening there? It's the same thing that Astrid Kirchherr did with the Beatles. That's setting the backstory. It's creating the backstory. It's setting the table to build the narrative. But Germany is a hotbed for the social engineers, Frankfurt and Tavistock. That's why the Beatles started there. That's why they were in Germany.
Makes a lot of sense, man. And God, I wish we had more time, Mike. I'm looking at the time. I'm like, we got like 2 minutes. So
Oh, I know. I tried to get as much in there, Rick, as I possibly could.
I'm hoping to get you back eventually. You're always welcome back. Definitely. And I would love to eventually have you back again. And because I think we're building a great you are building a great foundation from the ground up. And I love that we're not just covering the Beatles. We're building this foundation, getting to the Beatles, of how this is all starting. And now we're getting into the music of it, which is important because I'm like you. I know they've engineered the music. They're into the movies. And that's what we're getting into. And you broke it down amazing. I can't thank you enough. And I hope people will check out your channels. I'm making sure I keep putting the links in there. Please, guys, go check it out. Mike gets into everything. Like if you go to his channel, the Paul is Dead channel, he breaks all of this down and really gets into all of it. So, and you can definitely do that at your own leisure and learn way more than what we're covering here. There's so much. It's how do you fit it in?
Well, Rick, what we have to understand is don't take the Beatles personally.
Right. It's a good point.
Understand that the Beatles are one of many major psychological operations that have been put in play over time.
Yeah.
Do you want a recent one? How about COVID?
Yeah.
COVID was a major psychological operation.
Yeah, I've said that too. Well, and to make it personal, even for me, I was like you were a Beatles fan. I was a huge Doors fan. The surprise I got when I started digging into the origin of the Doors, I'm like, oh my God, so I get it.
Yeah, read Dave McGowan's book.
Yeah, it's crazy. So hopefully people are gonna look into this, Mike. I can't thank you enough. Thank you so much for coming back here and taking time to talk to all of us, because I think this is going to get people really questioning and thinking, and at least looking into things. And I want to thank everybody for in the chat. You guys were on fire tonight. And I will leave links for all of Mike's stuff. Please go check out his work. And Mike, thank you once again so much. You're always welcome back. Please remember that, my friend.
Thank you, Rick.